As the only witch on the continent, she lived for 300 years. She was so powerful that she could destroy an entire country, but she didn't really care. Her hatred for people is so great that she has goosebumps all over her skin. So she shut herself away and began to live in the mountains. That was until she met him. She saved the stranger and followed him to the kingdom. The witch had his back, made him her heir, and gave her the throne. Not out of duty, not out of fear, simply because she had once believed in him more than in herself. He had merely repeated her lessons, to eliminate everything that stood in the way. His sword pierced her stomach. And there was no reason, no answer, just pain and her last breath. He had killed her, the man she had trusted. But life was not completely extinguished. The magical core that held her soul survived. Thanks to this, she managed to escape. Irene had hoped that 10 years in the spirit world would give her the strength to return. But instead of resurrection, something else happened. Reincarnation. Her consciousness awakened in the body of a child. The witch didn't cry, not at all. Her gaze remained calm, almost indifferent. To those around her, it seemed strange. But to her, everything was obvious. She didn't want to be reborn in this body. She didn't want to be reborn again, especially in this form. Her soul was placed in the body of a child. It happened without consent, without will, as if someone's toy had simply been thrown into a new shell. Irene's silence was taken as a worrying sign. People were bustling around, discussing whether to call a doctor, and of course, resorted to the usual thing. A few painful slaps on the thighs. The mighty Irene felt humiliated and angry. The Fire Witch, the mistress of the southern mountains, had been reborn only to be spanked like a normal baby. As the hand rose for another blow, the girl broke. She opened her mouth and screamed, not out of fear but to stop this nonsense. Her scream brought relief to everyone present. Light pats on the back, warm smiles, reassuring whispers. All of this only intensified the feeling of powerlessness. The witch wanted to be indignant, to respond, even to shoot back with a glare, but her body wouldn't listen. They called her a princess. Everyone prayed that she would survive. Then the witch wondered for the first time, who was this child, into whose body her soul had taken possession? But even if she knew the answer, she would not have been able to change anything. Why did she become like this? Why did that scum betray her? The youngest prince of the Carell kingdom is Lacus. He was hated by his own brother, the hereditary prince. He was ambushed near the southern desert. Pursued by mercenaries, Lacus barely made it to the mountains where she was. Falling to his knees, he begged for salvation, and something changed in her. For the first time, she felt human emotions and fell in love. So she saved him and followed him to the kingdom of Carell. On the day he was supposed to propose to her, things went differently. He got down on one knee as if to propose, praising her for the strength she had taught him. But instead of a ring, a blade. If it weren't for this body, she would still be wandering the spirit world. Almost 10 years is too long for a human soul, especially one that lived with a thirst for revenge. Revenge on Lacus, the traitor whose smile once seemed genuine. But now everything has changed. Reincarnation has opened a path for her. Maybe she can reach him sooner. Perhaps revenge wouldn't wait a decade. And wasn't that her only motto, to kill Lacus? But for now, she was powerless. She was only a year old in this body. A toothless, frail creature who couldn't even express her will. She had to grow up first. A maid approached the cradle. She spoke in a high, awkwardly affectionate voice, leaned over with a smile, and offered milk and a clean diaper. But the little girl's mind was filled with indignation. She shook her head furiously, trying to stop this senseless care. To touch her body so lightly was impudence. The woman froze. Something more than surprise appeared in her eyes. Realization. She began to understand. The princess the baby was reacting too consciously. It was wrong. The girl turned away with alienation. But she could not say the words. Her body still did not obey. The maid whispered something disturbingly quietly, as if confessing her fear. She dreamed that the princess was ordinary. Here, in this place, unusualness could turn into disaster. She said it as if she were praying. I wonder what country fate has thrown her into. There was no answer, and even if she had wanted to ask, she couldn't. The only thing left to do was silently watch the maid hurrying off to get some milk. And inside, despair was growing. She wasn't going to eat this miserable liquid. She had character, she had pride, she had taste. But for now, she had no choice. Lynn, a mere mortal, with all her daily worries, apparently failed to catch any hint and quickly disappeared out the door. That was even for the best. Silence was the only luxury at the moment. There was neither strength nor maneuverability in the new body, limited by children's muscles and bones. The girl carefully lowered her arms and legs and looked up at the ceiling, white, cold, alien. It would be good to be in silence for a while. But the silence did not hide weakness. Instead of the usual sudden movement, only a small, defenseless hand appeared in the air, blocking the narrow field of vision. Once she had had the body of a witch, powerful, full of strength and fire. In that life, only one person had dared to strike her. Now she was trapped in a flesh that couldn't even hold on to its own dignity. If there were even one mana star in this body, perhaps it would be able to draw to itself the remnants of the sealed power that still slumbered in the soul. We need to check. Again. She closed her eyes, folded her tiny hands across her chest, and tried to concentrate. All her attention slipped from her toes to her feet. The tingling slowly rose from her ankles to her wrists, and when it reached her chest, it turned into a hot explosion. She took a deeper breath. The power she released burned like a flame, and then everything around her was filled with white light. 5 stars. It was like a dream. She didn't believe it and immediately repeated everything again. But the result didn't change. Once, before she became a witch, she had only 2 mana stars at this age, and now she's a genius, a body born with potential she had never known before. This continent was definitely within her grasp. And in that moment, joy came, warm and sharp, like wine before battle. The maid muttered softly, saying that the princess was so polite she didn't even cry when her diapers needed changing. The shame that came over her was almost physical. If it were possible to die of humiliation, she would have disappeared long ago. Both hands covered her face in an attempt to hide from the world. But the tiny fingers couldn't even completely cover her cheeks. This body was too small, too fragile. She had to grow up, and as quickly as possible. Then she could rule. Then everything would be different. Lynn returned with a smile and suggested a walk. She gently picked up the child in her arms and assured him that as long as she was with him, everything would be safe. But what did this security mean? The girl did not understand. Wasn't she born into a royal family? Shouldn't she be protected in her own right? What empire was she in after all? Where did this anxiety, these hints come from? Questions appeared one after another, but there were no answers, and she couldn't ask them yet, because she was only a year old. Lynn slowly walked out into the corridor, looking around every corner. The soft rustle of her footsteps dissolved in the silence of Dandelion Palace, the place where all the heirs to the throne were born. "This is where," she said, "the princess was supposed to stay until she was 5. Lynn spoke absently, as if she herself couldn't believe the length of her monologue. Later, she noted, the child would have choices, and their own palace. But that was still a long way off. For now, it should be comfortable enough here. Suddenly, she heard a cry, frightened, surprised, almost indignant. The princess had done something incomprehensible again. Lynn's behavior. Maybe it was the way she spoke, not explaining anything properly, throwing in incomprehensible words. If she had to explain something, then from beginning to end. Lynn, confused by her irritation, held the child close to her and began to rock her. Lightly, gently, but with such force that the body swayed from side to side. She was looking for the reason for the whim. Maybe the child was hungry? After all, they had just changed the diaper. But something stopped her. The woman froze instantly, and her shoulders shook. Someone entered. He was addressed as Your Majesty, the emperor and father of the child. His figure stood out from the others. Tall, broad-shouldered, he walked slowly but with the confidence that belies strength. His snow-white hair fell to his shoulders, and his body radiated mana of such density that even a baby could sense that he was a powerful magician. And something about him was familiar. As if this face had already appeared in her memory once, somewhere, once. But no matter how hard she tried to remember, emptiness reigned in her head. Is she so old that her memory is failing her? A calm voice broke her out of her confusion. Someone remarked that the princess had hair exactly like the emperor himself. This name, Aeskin, the dragon, with whom she had a very complicated relationship. And suddenly, this memory appeared for no reason. Unexpectedly, disturbingly. And she furrowed her eyebrows warily. The emperor tilted his head, touched his chin, examining the baby. Then, abruptly, he grabbed her tiny hand. The movement was too rough for the child's body, almost like a blow. The pain came in hot waves, as if someone were dragging an iron rake across the skin. Tears came instantly, eyes widened, breath caught. Desperately, as much as her weak body would allow, she bit into his hand. But instead of a bite, there was only the soft touch of her gums. Too weak, too small. The emperor didn't even move. Lin rushed back, snatching her from the ruler's hands, and spoke pleadingly. She assured him that it was only a child's mistake. She was still a child. Only a child. Their gazes crossed. The emperor's gaze was direct, attentive. As if he was reading her, as if he was weighing her. And then he smiled. White mana wiped the saliva from his hand in an instant. As if amused, he spoke of potential, of choosing a path. Probably even the path of the sword. Lin froze, her body tensed like a string. She quickly reminded him. The child hadn't even celebrated its first birthday yet. Still quite a baby, but the emperor knew otherwise. This baby survived the blow of his power. That's why he decided to give her the name Leona. And looking her in the eye, no longer as a father, but as a ruler, he challenged her. He wanted to see if her teeth would become lion-like, worthy of the king of beasts, or if they would remain ordinary, wild. Hope nourished him, but expectations were also ruthless. She really thought something was wrong with him. She turned her head to follow the emperor as he walked slowly past, and out of the corner of her eye, she caught a sword attached to his belt. The blade, which seemed painfully familiar, brought an unsettling jolt of memory. Her eyes widened involuntarily. She rubbed them with her palms, but the picture did not change. The hilt bore the horns of a black dragon, the same one that a mortal had once defeated. And the hilt was adorned with silver wings, the remains of a former fairy queen. And she, like the dragon, had fallen at the hands of man. Lin shuddered with excitement. Her eyebrows flew up, tears glistening in her eyes. She apologized in a whisper, continuously, as if trying to relieve a burden of guilt she couldn't escape. Tomorrow is the day when the princess must choose a sword. Such is the will of the imperial charter. From now on, she is one of those who enter the fight for the throne. An empire where heirs compete among themselves for the right to power. She knew only one like that. The world before her eyes shifted. She closed her eyelids. If this was indeed the place, then the man with the gray hair, the scent of dragon, and the icy eyes could only be him. The same one. The emperor, a descendant of dragon blood. The one who was once called a dog, who rushed into battle as if in madness. A man who left a mark on the memory of even her former life. She heard Lin say a new name. Leona. Leona von Gassis. She had to remember it. And only when the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, when the name, the sword, and the smell of power merged into a single truth, did it dawn on her. It stuck. And it really stuck. After all, what is the probability that she was born the daughter of the man who tried to kill her? Emperor Kasisu is a creature who has long since transcended the human realm. One whose blood flows through the veins of a dragon, and the same one who once saw her not as an equal, but as a petty mongrel worthy only of destruction. There was no honor in their clash, only rage burning on both sides. More than 20 years had passed since she had destroyed a caravan that had dared to cross her mountain pass without permission, defending her own lands. Back then, she had still been a witch, confident, strong, and invincible. But those merchants were no ordinary ones. Behind them stood not only the Cassis Empire, the most powerful on the continent, but also the imperial house itself. That alone would have been enough to curse her with all the living. But it turned out that those traders were carrying something much more important, artifacts recognized as national treasures. The emperor reacted like a crazed predator. He personally tracked her down and went to kill her. not just to punish her, but to destroy every last spark of magic, to her very essence. There was only one thing left for her to do: to break the pride that had held her for centuries, to clench her heart and flee. She turned into a mouse, threw away the greatness she had once been proud of, and disappeared among the stones. If she had stayed, she wouldn't have survived. Even her soul would have been torn to pieces. Since then, even in her sleep, she had unconsciously turned her head away from the Casey's empire. And now, she had woken up in the body of the daughter of this ruthless beast. How did this happen? Could fate really be so cruel? She, an old witch who had seen kingdoms fall, was seriously considering leaving this body before it was too late. Because if the emperor finds out who is now hiding behind his child's eyes, she won't just disappear. Not even a shadow of her will remain. The potential of this body was too valuable to simply waste it on resting in the spirit world. There would be no such brilliant, almost five-star mana. This body, if properly cultivated, could not only conquer an empire, it could take revenge. And personal revenge would take on the scale of state policy. This child's blood is imperial, from the line of rulers. To refuse the gift just because her father was that same ugly dwarf with dragon eyes would be foolishness, unworthy even of a novice sorcerer. The system she was caught up in was simple. In the Casus imperial family, only the strong survived. Many children, and only one throne. Everything between them is a struggle. Blood, conspiracies, the fall and victory of one and only. The one who endures to the end becomes the emperor. The one who now sat on the throne had once killed 37 of his brothers, one by one, without pity, and he was the same one who had once tried to destroy her. Fear was somewhere under her ribs, heavy, salty. Even the baby's body reacted. Drool appeared at the corners of her lips. It would be a lie to say that she wasn't afraid. Her birth in this body was not just fatal, it was almost a mockery of fate. But to give up? No. In this system, there is only struggle. They kill each other, and then wear mourning colors, pretending to be moral. And that's why it was the perfect stage for her to speak. For she was a witch whose name was feared by mercenaries, a witch who made horsemen weep and kings wake at night from dreams of her voice. And yes, she was only a year old now, so the laughter sounded innocent and sweet. But even in that laughter, there was a promise hidden. Born the 12th princess in the Cassis Empire, she was immediately thrown into the succession meat grinder. According to custom, she should have been kept in the palace of the flower pot until she turned 5. But the emperor changed everything. He placed her before the sword. That meant only one thing. He recognized her. The same monster that had once sought to wipe her from the face of the world now recognized her as worthy of participation. She didn't just have to become an empress. She would become one. She would trample Carell, that lush land of Lacus, and extend the shadow of her power across the continent. For with this body, she would achieve anything. Leona laughed again and raised her head slightly. There was no hesitation in her gaze, only the quiet certainty of one who had already made up her mind. In the royal family, the choice of the sword had never come down to metal. It was always a man's choice, the one who would become both shield and weapon. Hundreds stood before her, some in armor, others in robes, gleaming steel and echoing magic. But she wasn't looking at them. She was looking for just one. Her hand rose slowly, but pointed precisely. A woman no one would pay attention to. The people around them were surprised that Princess Leona had chosen such an ordinary idler. But for Harriet Reiser, the imperial aide, this choice was not accidental. His gaze was trained to see what was hidden, and he saw. The princess had made her choice consciously. He remembered yesterday's meeting with the emperor. There was no direct explanation then, only silence, so eloquent that it left no doubt. The emperor saw something important in the palace of the flower. Perhaps it was there that he met the princess, but that didn't matter anymore. In this family, the only thing that mattered was whether the new figure posed a threat. Power, potential, danger, that was what truly worried the court. Harriet didn't wait for an answer when she asked the question. The emperor never wasted words, but then he said something that needed no explanation. After that, Harriet canceled all audiences, even a meeting with the two princes, and hurried to the selection ceremony. And she made it, just in time for the selection to take place. His gaze slid to the girl, round-headed, with strands of hair as soft as cotton candy, and eyes that sparkled with calm curiosity. She seemed like a creature from a fairy tale. Her little chubby legs moved in the air, as if beating the rhythm of her own carefree world. Her arms moved like a marshmallow dance. Harriet felt something snap in her chest. It was hard to breathe. It seemed as if this creature sitting before him couldn't be real. She was too sweet, too innocent, and yet too precise in her decisions. The princess turned her head in his direction. Their eyes met, and at that moment, a smile lit up her face. Harriet's heart beat faster, and he clutched his chest as if trying to hold it inside. When he looked at the girl again, his legs gave way. His body fell to the ground like a sheaf of grass cut down by a sudden gust of wind. A murmur rose in the crowd. The princess just continued to laugh. And from the side, someone exclaimed in surprise that the assistant had fallen. The girl, whose little body held the memory of more than she was allowed to have at 1 year old, looked at the man lying on the stretcher. She knew his name without fail. Harriet Reiser, the emperor's aide-de-camp, known as a knight of the first rank. He had once turned 5 ogres into dry, bitter fields of wormwood in a single day. Not a trace of their banners remained. The memory of that encounter flashed through her mind. Harriet tried to cross her mountain range without permission. Then she won, and from the fragments of his armor she made an exquisite bowl, not so much as a trophy, but as a keepsake. But now he looked different, stronger. People seemed to grow up too fast, and she didn't know when her year-old body would catch up with her mind. Harriet's consciousness was clouded. What had made him faint she did not know. But she did not care too much. Her thoughts had already moved on to something more important, to the woman she had chosen. The woman had no left hand, but she stood straight, without the slightest hesitation. The others could not hide their surprise. Why did the princess choose her? But no explanation came. Not because there were no words, but because there was no desire to explain. Before her stood the most powerful necromancer on the continent. She knew that necromancers were not simply sorcerers who raised the dead. The most skilled of them used the power of the dead so skillfully that they could build an army of shadows and bones. The higher their skill, the more creatures they raised from oblivion. In battle, such mages were indispensable, but to the general public, their true names remained in the shadows. Plus, that's why this woman was the perfect companion, the perfect sword. Stories about her reached back when the girl, as a mountain creature, lived on the very edge of the ridge. Nightly expeditions, having just learned about the necromancer, tried to eliminate the threat, but not all of them returned. It was said that she had destroyed 20 wyverns and turned them into the obedience of the dead. Others whispered that King Jacques, who had attempted to attack her at dawn, had been wiped off the face of the earth before noon. Her name then became a challenge. The girl dreamed of a duel with her. But Cage, that was the woman's name, never appeared in her mountains. And now they have met. Although there will be no duel, not with a body that is just learning to hold a spoon. Cage became her sword, so now she had to protect the one who once dreamed of defeating her. I wonder why the necromancer woman agreed to serve the child. The reason could be anything, but it didn't matter. The main thing was that she was there. And therefore, with her, the princess was safe. Reaching out to Cage, the child's body bumped into an invisible wall. The woman stepped back. The small hand froze in midair. What is this? No aggressive movement, no threat, just a simple gesture. But Cage moved away again. And although the girl's voice sounded sweet, almost childlike, the woman still did not come closer. Her cheeks were flushed. Perhaps she was afraid of catching the disease, or perhaps something else was keeping her at a distance. The princess noticed this, but said nothing. What good is it if even the simplest expressions of affection are ignored? The heat in the room became unbearable. Sweat covered his forehead. His eyes watered. His body burned with fever. Her nose snorted softly as she glanced at Cage again. And it was at that moment that the one who had just been hiding from view rushed towards her. Cage's palm touched the small hand, but too hard. The princess tried to break free, but in vain. Pain. This body lacked the strength even to protest. Cage held her lightly, as if she were holding a fluffy pillow. What a shame that she was so tiny compared to her. Lynn's voice cut through the room, soft but confident. She seemed to be the only one who truly understood her. Unlike other worthless people, this woman had at least a little sense of boundaries. Cage let go of the princess's hand before Lynn could finish her sentence. Then she quickly looked back, and in a moment she was dragging the large stranger to the bed. The man said his name was Ver, and he was a psychotherapist. His voice was as soft as a breath. The princess looked at Cage, waiting for confirmation, but she avoided her eyes. Lynn nodded nervously, allowing Vera to approach. The princess shrugged her shoulders. That's all human pettiness. She turned away contemptuously, but still held out her hand for inspection. Veer just touched it, and shock appeared on his face. He muttered something about the priest. What? For what? Mana, he explained. There was too much of it. The mana in this body was 5-star level. This couldn't be natural. The whole body was ablaze with internal fire. If nothing is done, the princess's life will be in danger. Lynn's mouth dropped open in surprise. Cage just shook her head, as if she already understood. The rest of the room began to whisper excitedly. Why didn't anyone notice the sweat? Why didn't anyone notice the shaking in his shoulders? Because they are all blind. She was not in pain. She was simply happy. She dreamed of becoming an empress. Is that a crime? They asked how she could stand it without crying. She just listened to their fuss. That's all. Someone mentioned Eskina's blessing. But it was not the old dragon's gift. It was her own power. And neither of them understood who they were dealing with. One shouted that he would call a doctor immediately. The others were busy, not noticing that she was almost screaming, but none of them understood her words. The doctor assured her that the mana was still in the child's body, but it wouldn't do any harm. The proper measures had been taken too quickly. Cage listened to him in silence and nodded faintly. For now, everything was stable. Outwardly, there was complete calm. But deep within her dark eyes, something flickered, a brief flash of anger, as if she had finally guessed who had the audacity to saturate the child's body with someone else's mana. The doctor said something else in farewell, a polite formality, always ready, and left. The door closed behind him, and as soon as the sound died down, Cage approached the cradle. The little princess slept peacefully, her thumb pressed to her face, which remained warm even in her sleep. Cage looked at her with a cold impassiveness that concealed something more complicated. She had once been the most feared necromancer on the continent. She had been carried away by bloody battles for years, and she had no illusions about her fate. One day death would come to her right where she was used to living, on the battlefield. But there was one promise, an oath to the emperor himself, sealed by the river of death. It was this promise that had forced her to return to the Casus Empire. That was why she was here now, the body of a guard, the soul bound by an oath. Still not accepting it internally, Cage initially wanted only to escape, or, in the worst-case scenario, destroy the one she was supposed to protect and disappear without a trace. That's what she thought until the moment she saw Leona. Looking into the princess's wide-open eyes for the first time, Cage saw not a pitiful child, but a frightened creature, similar to a rabbit, still weak, still confused, but one that would not run away. Something that can endure, a little rabbit, in whose heart something bigger was already burning, the opportunity to become a predator. She reached out and touched the child's cheek, warm, soft, alive. From that touch, a silent promise was born. She would protect her. Leona lay quietly, her eyes fixed on the people bustling around her. Today was moving day. The little princess was finally leaving Dandelion Court to settle in her own palace. At first, it was planned that she would remain under his protection for a long time, but her participation in the struggle for the throne changed everything. Her new place was already waiting for her. The servants were packing up. Lynn didn't move a step, glancing anxiously at the girl in the cradle every now and then. She was too anxious after the story with the mana, especially since the princess had somehow escaped from her arms. Now Lynn was terrified of leaving her unattended, but this time she didn't need to worry. Cage was standing next to her. The princess looked at her and smiled. Cage immediately took a step back. Strange. Ever since she started meeting her eyes, Cage had always blushed and backed away. Was her smile really that scary? Lin, noticing the displeasure on the child's face, rushed towards her. The question hung in the air. Was she bored? The princess wasn't bored. She was angry. Angry at Cage, who was staying away. Did Lin guess what was going on in that little head? Her gaze kept jumping from the girl to Cage, and her hands clenched into fists, then relaxed again. Time passed, and the meeting dragged on. Lin sighed and began to rock the cradle gently. Then she looked around, as if remembering something, and reached into the drawer. She offered a toy. A rattle. A familiar gesture flashed before her eyes. Lin shook it, making a ringing sound. The princess turned away. The Great Witch doesn't play with rattles. Lin didn't understand. She thought it was a sign of interest. She smiled and held out the toy again. Then the girl turned away again, this time with obvious resentment. Can't anyone see that she's no longer a baby? She stirred, showing her indignation. Lin was confused and began to rummage through her other toys, but just then the princess saw her, and her eyes widened. A hand reached out. A burnt rabbit doll. No sign of the original fabric. One leg torn, cotton wool sticking out. Missing eye. Ear torn off. A toy that should have been thrown away long ago. Lin disappeared. Her smile was polite, but doubt was evident in every movement. She reached to pick up the rabbit, but the child was already reaching for it. Give it back. It's mine, but the maid hesitated. Too old, too shabby, but could anything be done against such a look? Finally, she held out the doll. The princess hugged it tightly. It wasn't the toy itself that was important. Its mana. Old, dark as smoke. And familiar to ants. Why does this doll breathe dark mana? Her own mana was 5 stars. But in her heart, she would jump for joy if she could strengthen it even more. Leona fell asleep, holding tightly in her little hands a charred rabbit doll. Cage looked at her and barely suppressed a bitter laugh. Even she understood how inappropriate such an old toy looked in the hands of an heiress of imperial blood. But Lin answered calmly. This doll was brought by the princess's mother, the Empress. It turned out that Leona's maternal lineage came from the Principality of Lan. The Empress loved playing with dolls in her youth, and often took them with her to the palace. Lin said this quietly, never taking her eyes off Leona, who was breathing evenly, her cheek pressed against the rabbit. She wiped away her tears. It hurt her to see the princess like this, but the Empress was gone. Cage sighed briefly, as if the memory had burned her. Lin wiped her eyes again. She said everyone felt sorry for Leon. At her age, children are just beginning to bond with their parents, but she wasn't destined to. She had just turned a year old, and she was already embroiled in a succession plot. It was true, but Cage shook her head. There was no point in feeling sorry for the princess. She was strong. Cage saw her strength. This child had endured the pain of a mana drain, the same agony that would knock even adults off their feet. Small, yet fearless, she had incredible potential, but for now she remained fragile. Cage shook her head again, slowly, sadly. She leaned down and pinched the princess's cheek lightly, soft as a cloud. The feeling was strange, elusive, and Cage looked away awkwardly as her own cheeks began to flush. Evening fell on the palaces as Lin carried the princess in her arms. Her new home would be the Black Rose Court. As soon as Cage heard the name, her face turned cold and her gaze filled with anger. The name of this place sounded like a sentence to her. She knew that the shadows of the dead royal family lived there. Too many stories, too much silent fear. It's too dark a place for a child. Cage gripped Lin's hand so tightly that she flinched. Lin's voice was filled with alarm, but she didn't back down. She was not frightened by the presence of ghosts. On the contrary, she herself requested the transfer. Not of her own free will, but because of the Empress's last wish. And although everything inside was clenching with fear, she could not disobey. Cage was silent. Her gaze slid from Lin to the child and back again. The words did not leave her lips, and the feelings were mixed with anxiety. Lin held little Leona tightly to her chest, shielding her from the invisible cold of the palace. It was more than just an order. It was an assignment from which there was no escaping. Cage looked down. She tried to compose herself and even gave a thumbs up as if it might change the atmosphere. She said the place was wonderful, that she liked it, but her ears were red and her voice was nervous. Lin apologized to the princess, admitting that she was scared. But she promised that she would fulfill the Empress's will, even if her heart cried out for something else. If anyone had any doubts, Lin still asked for patience. Her voice was soft, but there was anxiety in it. She asked to be given a chance. The princess shook her head, her gaze settling on the palace ahead. It looked majestic, with graceful towers and massive arches, but its beauty had something disturbing about it. The gardens around were covered with black roses. Their dark splendor penetrated to the bones. Just looking at these flowers made you feel eerie, and that's when it became clear why Cage mentioned the ghosts that, according to her, still inhabit the walls of this place. Surprisingly, none have shown up yet. The child's mother seemed to be a strange woman. Otherwise, why would there have been a mention of this palace in the will? Why leave an order to leave the princess here? The thoughts were still swirling in her head when a sudden cold current ran over her skin. Her hair stood on end. She stopped and looked around. The feeling was familiar. A dark mana, the same as that of a rabbit doll. Its invisible presence seeped from the depths of the palace. The unknown attracted. The princess stretched her arms forward, as if calling to the palace itself. Lin, noticing this, smiled and quickened her pace. The closer they got, the thicker the darkness around them became. The mana was enveloping, heavy and pulsating. It took their breath away. Something was hidden inside. The palace was not empty. Her gaze slid to Cage. If she could feel it, so could Cage. It was strange. Cage acted calmly, as if she hadn't noticed anything. No reaction, no tension in her gaze. She should have been stronger. She should have felt the mana swirling around her. But nothing happened. A gust of wind blew from somewhere, but something had changed about him. He carried magic. Cage quickly approached and stood beside him, raising her hand, preparing to use force. The princess opened her eyes wide and looked around. In the middle of the wind stood a boy, blonde hair, red eyes. His face was similar to the emperor's, very slightly, but similar. His gaze swept over her indifferently. Then he said something sharp. The words were like a threat. Even if they didn't sound direct, there was a cold hostility in them. He didn't believe she would survive, and he certainly didn't believe such a child could be an heir. The princess wanted to scream, to say even a word. But her voice betrayed her. Leona just silently screamed inside. Her desire was clear, to drive him away, once again, even harder. But the boy stayed. He didn't move away, he just stared. There was something contemptuous, even mocking in his gaze. The princess's small body shuddered with insult. If she had been even a little older, she would have finished with him right away. But now she could only be angry and swallow her powerlessness. Her eyes filled with tears. She could not contain her emotions. Her gaze burned with rage and bitterness. The boy smiled. It got worse. And then he said the word. Rabbit! Something inside him clenched. The princess glared at him angrily, then hid in Lin's neck, pressing into her skin. The door to the office swung open with force. Harriet entered, holding back her anger. His voice was firm as he addressed the emperor. He asked if this was really his doing. The emperor frowned. He took off his glasses and looked at Harriet silently. Despite his confidence, Harriet swallowed involuntarily. He said he wasn't afraid, but his eyes betrayed otherwise. The emperor clicked his tongue. He asked what had happened again. Harriet only sighed. He asked if His Majesty had heard what everyone was saying. His Highness pursed his lips contemptuously. He didn't think it necessary to listen to low creatures. Harriet's face grew tired. Finally, he said what was the matter. Princess Leona had a mana leak. The emperor laughed. His sneer showed that he didn't believe it. In response, Harriet quickly added that Cage had noticed everything and had time to intervene. Otherwise, it would have been too late, because the mana is 5-star. Cage? A necromancer. Wasn't she the one he chose on purpose? The smile returned to the emperor's lips. She didn't disappoint. Harriet couldn't stand it. He asked angrily how one could smile after such a thing. The child was on the verge of death. The emperor slowly straightened a lock of hair. This careless gesture sent a chill down Harriet's spine. He swallowed again. The emperor asked what exactly he wanted to know. Harriet asked directly, was it he who gave the princess mana? The answer was obvious. Who would have believed that such power belonged to a child herself? Harriet was one of the few who knew. The emperor had met with the princess the day before. Anne threatened her. The emperor just waved his hands. He called Harry's name. He said it calmly, but there was a threat in the air. Harriet did not back down. He asked to tell the truth. The emperor smiled. He said that he did not kill children himself. The aide barely restrained himself from calling him mad out loud. The emperor added, "The girl has already chosen her sword, and therefore her fate is no longer in his hands." Harriet shuddered. His fists clenched tighter and tighter. This was a real problem. He couldn't forgive himself for not being able to protect this tiny but strong girl. In a family full of terrible men, she was the only bright and gentle being. Had the emperor even once looked at her properly? Even if not, how could he send her to war? Harriet called the emperor a terrible man. He squinted, studying his assistant carefully. He felt that the boy had already become attached to the child, even though he had only seen her once. Interesting. His Highness leaned back in his chair, arms folded. He announced that he had given the princess the court of the Black Rose. Harriet gasped. He couldn't believe it. It was too much, even for such a ruthless monarch. Everything had its limits, but he had crossed them again. Harriet was torn apart inside. How could he give such a gloomy palace to the sweet, gentle Leona? Even the main palace did not guarantee safety, and here was the court of the Black Rose. This was already crossing all limits. The emperor was behaving foolishly. Seeing that the emperor's face remained indifferent, Harriet became even more angry. Her voice trembled. What if she died? The emperor only sighed heavily. By order of the late empress, he had given Leona the palace. If Harriet had known about this, he would have gone mad with rage. His Highness said that if she dies, then that is her fate. The assistant turned away. Tears glistened in his eyes. The emperor's voice sounded contemptuous, and in general, why did he become his assistant? The advisor replied with a slight smile. He asked where else he would find such a wonderful assistant. Then he sighed silently and looked at His Highness. He had already decided everything for himself. He clenched his fists. A firmness flashed in his gaze. He would protect Leona, at any cost. The emperor laughed, loudly, long, too much. This laughter reached the corridor, where the fourth prince, Nickel, was standing stealthily. Casey's! He tilted his head in surprise. Who made his father laugh so loudly? Only the 12th princess? What's so special about her? Nikhil squinted. He decided he'd better go take a look. If she turned out to be worthless, he'd just get rid of her, without further ado. Chuckling, he left the shelter. But as soon as he stepped out of the shadows, he froze. In front of him stood a small creature with fluffy hair. Its skin was white as a marshmallow. Its eyes were red like rubies, shining in the semi-darkness. Nikhil didn't even blink. Nikhil squinted and tilted his head. Was there really a rabbit in front of him? The thin voice that came from the girl's lips struck him. Something fluttered in his chest. His hand involuntarily fell to his heart. Harriet had been wrong. No words could express the charm that emanated from this child. Cage interrupted his train of thought. Her voice was firm, almost cold. She turned to him, looking from Leona to him. She stood between them, and Nikhil frowned. Why was she interfering again? He did nothing, he just watched. But Cage didn't believe it. She said he was threatening the princess. He looked around in surprise. Who? Him? And when was that? Cage closed her eyes. Insolent. If she could, she would destroy him. But instead, she only tensed up, as if before a fight. Nikhil turned his attention back to the girl, and to her toy. The old, worn-out rabbit clutched in her little hands was disgusting. Why was she allowed to hold such a thing? Even a child deserves better. He wanted to snatch the doll from her hands and throw it away. He had already imagined giving the princess a luxurious toy. The most expensive, the best. She would be delighted. He knew it. But his daydreams were interrupted by Lynn. She quietly bowed her head. It turned out that the rabbit was a gift from the late empress, and Leona valued it above all else. Nikhil's eyes widened. He looked from the child to the toy. The girl is so small. She's not even a year old yet. And yet she remembers her mother's gift? Lynn didn't answer. She just smiled warmly. Nikhil looked away and blushed. He said something awkward. The request not to be so pathetic came out more like an embarrassed mumble. He raised his hands. A white fire ignited between his palms. A glow, pure and warm like the sun, touched the princess's skin. It was a blessing, the power of the sun god that the prince had just transferred. The girl blinked her eyes, as if she didn't understand. Then Lynn leaned down and whispered in her ear. It was Nikhil, her older brother. He had given her the power he himself had received from above. Leona smiled. She held out her hands to him. Nikhil touched her fingers and froze. The skin was softer than he could have imagined. His heart sank. Maybe all children were like that? Although, he himself had not been cute as a child. He wanted to stay a little longer, to see more. But time was running out. He promised to come again. Fortunately, the helpless infant period passed quickly. It had been 3 years since she had been in this body. Now her arms and legs moved freely, and her body obeyed. The cradle was a thing of the past. She could walk, she could talk. And although it sometimes seemed absurd, it was still progress. She wasn't little anymore. She was 3 years old. Lynn entered the room. A smile appeared on her face. Dimples adorned her cheeks. She immediately approached the princess. Her movements were light, careful. The nanny was glad that the child had woken up and hurried to help her with everything. The princess's stomach was grumbling, but she wanted tea even more. And although she herself did not understand why, this desire was unshakable. Suddenly, Lynn froze. The princess smiled faintly, watching her reaction. Her gaze was clear, her eyes alert. Lynn didn't answer right away. She just sighed and looked at the princess with tenderness. Now she could sit with her head held high, proud, confident, almost like that crazy emperor. She even resembled him in some ways. In her gaze, her posture, her silent audacity, she grew stronger every day. And though this body was still weak, it already had its strength. Once she had been a witch, and now she was a 3-year-old child. But still, it was better than nothing. Lynn laughed, gently pinched the princess's cheek, and moved to the sink. Wetting a soft towel, she carefully wiped her face and neck. The fabric was pleasant, the touch soothing. Lynn's eyes. She stroked the child's chubby cheek with such affection that the princess involuntarily trembled. The gesture was sincere, almost genuine. Sometimes it seemed like this woman could be trusted, but she knew she couldn't. Her smile was just a mask. Just the reaction of a small child who hadn't yet learned to control her emotions. She smiled not because she loved, but because she was weak. Leona shared moments from her dreams with Lynn. The princess's face was radiant with joy, and pride lived in the corners of her mouth. In her dreams, the emperor died many times. The girl recalled it with a smile, almost with tenderness. The words flew from her lips without causing any inner anxiety. She looked completely happy. Lynn froze. Her eyes widened, and her hands involuntarily dropped to her sides. It seemed her brain refused to accept what she had heard. The princess tilted her head, watching her. Her face filled with doubt. Something must have been said wrong. Leona tried to reassure Lynn. The emperor, she believed, was not one to die just like that. The words were sincere, but they only increased the maid's anxiety. Lynn slowly raised her hands, as if trying to keep her balance. One hand slid to her mouth, covering it from the horror. Then she braced herself, straightened herself, and called out sternly to Cage. Her voice was firm. Tension hung in the air. Cage's face turned as pale as snow before the spring sun. She tried to avoid the conversation, saying it wasn't the time, not now. But denying it didn't change anything. Lynn had already made up her mind. Her words sounded final, and there was nowhere to run. Cage sighed and followed. Her expression showed that she had no choice. The princess, despite her young age, watched intently. Adults had not yet learned to count on 3-year-old ears. They didn't even try to muffle their voices with mana, so it was extremely easy to eavesdrop. In the room beyond the door, Lynn began without prelude. Her accusations sounded like the blows of a whip. Caution has been said many times. The same goes for the fact that a child should see nothing but light and joy, but Cage still brought a runny nose to the princess's eyes. She was already used to these creatures and did not understand how terrible they were for a child. The princess, who was eavesdropping, thought for a moment. Were the undead really so terrible? It seemed not. They were weak, and weak things did not cause fear. Something else is scarier. For example, the emperor himself. He hasn't been around since her birth. Lin never called him. 3 years ago, he had been superhumanly strong, and now he seemed like a monster. The inner tension was growing. The goal was to become the empress, and that meant getting rid of all the heirs, perhaps even the emperor himself. But would the power be enough? Meanwhile, in the hallway, Lin's voice took on a menacing hardness. She warned Cage that something like this would never happen again. Otherwise, the consequences would be brutal. Cage only hissed that Lin was too cruel, but she didn't answer. She just pointed out that it was time to go to the princess with food. Arguing now was inappropriate. Cage, hearing this, declared that she wanted to eat too. They walked away together, because the tray was too small for several servings. Their voices disappeared around the corner. Leaving the princess alone was risky. Death could lurk around every corner. But with Cage, no matter how dangerous she was, the room remained secure. No assassin would dare enter. She turned her head to the window when the leaves of the large tree began to tremble. A black shadow appeared there. It was probably the murderer who could not penetrate the magical barrier. She thought for a moment, but not for long. On two short legs, she slowly walked to the balcony. It was outside the barrier, so the killer could approach her. The figure in black stood, and the only thing that could be seen were dark, cold, cruel eyes that shone with an ominous light. Leona pretended not to be afraid, grabbing the balcony railing and asking if he was really that strong. The killer first laughed, then replied that he could easily kill her with one hand. The princess, with a smile, replied that she was also capable. Her answer caused the murderer to laugh out loud. She spread her hands and whispered a word. A white chill ran down her arms, and the air around her was filled with a cold mist. Leona aimed an ice missile straight at the assassin. He was unprepared, and the beam trapped him, covering him from head to toe in ice. His eyes, wide with fear, froze in immobility. She thought he was weaker than he seemed, and spread her arms wide, and lightning flashed from them. The lightning bolt shot toward the killer. Leona was glad of the magic, because she hadn't used it in a long time. It was fun. Under her control, the killer wasn't dead, but he was on the verge. She came closer, and the fear in his eyes deepened. Then she touched his body with white light. The light instantly began to heal him. Even the killer couldn't understand what was happening when he felt his strength return. He fell to his knees, stunned and frightened, and it seemed that he understood that he had become weak and was now infinitely submissive. Leona quickly created lightning in her hand and told herself that it was time to end this story. The lightning struck the assassin, and she laughed out loud as she watched him fall under her control. A feeling of power and lightness filled her. The warm sunlight gently touched Leon's skin, causing him to yawn naturally. The material of the sofa was too soft, something that simply didn't exist in the mountainous southern regions. Lin called this fabric velvet. The princess tried to lie down on her left and right sides. No matter what, the soft texture touched her skin and gave a pleasant feeling of comfort. She thought it wasn't time to be lazy yet, but the 3-year-old's body told her otherwise. It was following its instincts. Her head was hidden in the fluffy velvet, and her thoughts involuntarily revolved around Cage, who had been by her side all day. This day, she was again considering whether she should admit that she was a magician. Only 3 years, and already a magician of the third circle. This has never happened before on this continent. The discovery of this fact could lead to new dangers, including attacks by assassins. Plus, Lacus would find out about it too, and then this fool would become even more dangerous. She would have to keep this secret until her body learned to control its magical potential. For now, it would be best to rest a little. She yawned and stretched. At that moment, Nikhil, the older brother, appeared. He always emphasized how lucky she was that he came to say hello. It was difficult for her to understand why a boy who was already 10 years old kept coming to her, even though he should have been fully focused on the struggle for the throne. The fatigue was easily read on her face. She looked up at him, puffing out her cheeks, and it seemed extremely cute. His brother's eyes widened in surprise. He asked where she learned to grimace like that. He then reached out his hands, but Cage quickly blocked his movement, which at first seemed like a rescue, but it was only the beginning. First, Cage demanded that the prince wash his hands, although Nikhil himself insisted that he had come clean. He pinched Leona's cheek, leaned close, saying that her skin was so tender and elastic that wherever he pulled, it tightened. Cage warned her to be careful not to hurt her, but Nikhil assured her that even if something happened, he would quickly heal his sister, because he had the power of the sun. He pinched the princess again, both cheeks, smiling so sweetly that she felt uncomfortable. She already knew not to trust him, and abruptly pulled his hand away. Then she asked a simple question, why he kept coming and doing as he pleased. Nikhil, stunned, couldn't answer right away, and then admitted that it was because he loved her. Cage couldn't help but intervene, declaring that she loved Leona more. The usual argument between them began. Leona couldn't intervene because suddenly old memories came flooding back, the ones she had tried to forget. 300 years ago, when she was still human, a man came to her, a traveling alchemist named Jean. She was an orphan, living in poverty, doomed to perish. She was starving, and for the first time, she heard someone ask her if she wanted to eat. The adult was kind and gave her something like a sandwich. No one had taught her to be wary of others, so instead of being suspicious, she trusted him. She was only 5 years old. The question of a name seemed unnecessary, since she didn't have one. The husband could not keep calling her baby and suggested giving her the name Irene. This name suited her, because even though she was small, she did not lose hope. She accepted this name, feeling her empty heart fill with warmth. Jean smiled and gently stroked her head. She thought this was love. It was easy for her to believe that word then. The girl took his hand and followed him to the tower where he lived. She did not yet realize what awaited her. The boy behind bars trembled, moaned, and begged for salvation. His voice poured from the dungeon, full of pain and fear, but it did not arouse a shadow of sympathy in Jean. He gave him a quick glance, indifferent, cruel, and with a cold voice said that he was still alive, but no longer needed. And the garbage, he said, should be cleaned up. Familiar to Irene. Then something broke even her childish notion of goodness. Jean, in whom she had trusted, was not just an alchemist. He sought a way to transplant demonic power into people to create weapons. But the bodies could not withstand it. Hundreds of children died while he continued his experiments, not stopping for a moment. Irene wanted to try it. She should have refused, but she couldn't. Not out of fear of pain, but out of terror of being rejected by him. She didn't want to see in his eyes the same emptiness he gave to other children. The alchemist said he loved her. She believed him. She endured everything. How her body rotted under the influence of demonic blood. How her lungs couldn't take the air mixed with black manna. Irene was silent while everything inside her was breaking down. And then he said she was a failure. All that had sounded like love had turned out to be nothing but a deception. There was no warmth in his words. Only irritation. Only disappointment. He made no secret of it. He no longer needed her. Irene's hand fell to the cold floor. Something snapped somewhere, either in my mind or in my heart. And then, darkness. When she opened her eyes, the tower lay in ruins. Everyone was dead. Death covered the ground like ashes. She looked at her own hands, foreign, grown up. She was 8, but her body had become a woman's. Jean said that if the experiment was successful, she would become a witch. And so it happened. The only one in the world. Her powers became exceptional, but what was the point? Those who said they loved her were lying. No one really loved her. She ran away. From people, from their words, from their I love yous. And 300 years later, she was left alone. In a mountain range. Her thoughtfulness lingered, and the two figures leaned closer, peering into each other's faces. Anxiety was evident in every movement. A sweat-soaked forehead, a gaze lost somewhere in memories. Someone suggested that she needed a doctor. Another joked about someone's appearance, and everything turned into the usual argument again. Their voices, dull and impatient, were like hammers hitting each other's temples. Leona couldn't take it anymore. Her head was splitting from the noise. Silently, she pulled Nikhil's hand. Her eyes closed wearily. It hurt. He had to shut up. He took a step back, but there was still a playful sparkle in his eyes. The smile was hidden behind his hand. She didn't understand. She had just wished him harm, and he looked as if he had heard something good. Gathering her strength, she stood up. Her legs were wobbly, but her body was straight. It seemed that she was struggling to push through her own fatigue to finally say that she did not need sympathy. She doesn't need to be loved. She doesn't need to be worried. And if anyone dares to utter the word love again, death awaits them. There is no place left for her to trust in this world. The two of them looked at her in silence, then turned away and began to whisper, discerning the truth they did not want to admit aloud. Mother is dead. There is no one left but the maid. Leona lives alone, still a child, and the burden is an adult. Her body settled back on the bed, as if every muscle protested against movement. She didn't wipe her sweaty face herself. Nikhil did that. Cage was right there, as close as a sword, unwavering and loyal. But Nikhil pushed her aside to meet Leona's gaze once more. He spoke of the imperial house, of power, of protection, which he promised even when he himself became part of this machine. His hands touched her cheeks. His smile was calm, almost homely. He suggested something, and Cage immediately agreed. They both wanted to give her something more than just words. They wanted to be there, always, and over time, there will be more like them. But Leona wanted to see them. She didn't want to hear them. People are always the same. They swear, they lie, they betray, they hurt. And that won't change. Despite this, their voices did not subside. They sounded close together, gentle, gentle. One said that he loved her. The other repeated the same, both sincerely. But his cheeks were burning, as if from heat, and even if his heart responded, his mind remained firm. There would be no more trust. And perhaps there never would be. The princess was irritated to the point of sneering. They were touching her cheeks and hair again, as if she really was the defenseless rabbit they had called her. It was all becoming unbearable. Leona had already lived a human life 3 times, over 300 years, and had no desire to endure unnecessary caresses. The arguments flared up again. One tried to push the other away, under the guise of promises of protection, and the princess only thought about how tired she was of not being taken seriously. The air felt too hot, and his nose felt stinging. Nikhil covered his face with his hand and lowered his eyes. His shoulders trembled, but not with fear, as she would have liked. And he should have been afraid. She was the great witch. One of them called her sad, the other called her grown-up. But then he still clarified that she was quite small. She turned away, refusing to accept these caresses. It hurt when someone said Leona didn't love him, as if it really mattered. And she didn't care. She didn't ask for love. She rejected it. At that moment, the air changed. Something moved outside the window, and a shadow flashed past. Leona didn't react immediately. She paused only a moment before the collision. A simultaneous magical explosion revealed a figure in the black smoke. Cage cut through the curtain, revealing a silhouette. It was a guest, an unwanted one. They rushed to check on the princess, but the black smoke didn't even touch her. Nikhil sighed in relief and, again without asking permission, touched her head. His face was radiant with joy. Cage looked pleased too. She couldn't understand it. It was hard for her to accept the fact that she was now being protected by others. It made her feel an inexplicable tightness in her chest, what people called emotion. Leona had no answer for that. Even when she was human, she had not been taught to feel, so understanding others was beyond her experience. But regardless, it was nice. Meanwhile, Nikhil noticed something strange. It turned out that the stranger had not died from his magic, and not from Cage's power. They looked at each other with anxiety. All eyes turned to the new figure, Harriet. He approached unnoticed, and Leona didn't even feel his mana. It was maddening. Her power was no match for his, and it made everything inside twist. She clenched her fists. Sooner or later, she would be stronger than him. Harriet, as always, appeared with a smile. completely unaware of what was going on in her mind. The advisor reprimanded Cage, saying he needed to protect himself better. He even managed to hide behind her when both of them attacked him indignantly. Leona looked away awkwardly. She didn't want to look at him anymore. He seemed crazy, and she didn't want to deal with it. The princess deliberately tried to ignore him with all her might. And strangely enough, in this chaos, it was she who began to seem the most normal to herself. She needed to grow up, faster, as soon as possible. Harriet, meanwhile, declared that he had not come for Leona. He had business with the prince. Nikhil, not hiding his hostility, pointed to himself. He did not like this man. And it was mutual. The advisor didn't hide his mockery and immediately warned him that if he wasn't careful with his words, he wouldn't live long. There was almost a sense of tension between them. Nikhil, irritated, reminded Harriet of his age. But Harriet brushed it off, saying that he was only 30. He was still full of strength and had no intention of disappearing from the arena. And when he added that he was stronger, Nikhil fell silent. No matter how gifted the prince was, he was no match for the experience of an adult sorcerer. And only then did Harriet finally announce the purpose of her visit. Tomorrow is the second prince's birthday. The emperor is giving a banquet. The entire royal family is invited to it. Leona's heart stopped for a moment. She really didn't expect to hear this. Nikhil announced that he did not intend to attend the celebration, but Harriet immediately objected. Attendance was mandatory. The emperor himself had ordered it. No exceptions. The prince only glanced sideways at Leona, as if looking for an opportunity to dodge. But here, too, they answered without hesitation. The girl was not on the list of invitees. Harriet even shook her head, emphasizing the obvious. Sighing, Nikhil asked if his father would be there. To this, he received a mocking remark. The emperor's order had already been announced. Did he, by any chance, have the memory of a goldfish? He snorted and promised that when he became emperor, the first thing he would do was deal with him. Harriet only joked that she would probably have to run away first, and glanced in the direction of the princess. She was disgusted by his smile, so she simply ignored it. Instead, she turned to Nikhil. He smiled broadly, happily called her cute, and asked if she wanted a hug. Leona did not hide her desire. She wanted to get there, see the royal family, not miss the opportunity. She announced that she would go too, but a strange silence fell around. Nikhil instantly pulled her closer and denied it. She didn't have an invitation, but she assured him that if he took her with him, everything would be fine. His voice became softer, but insistent. He could not take her with him. This place was too dangerous. Even Harriet agreed that the second prince was not one to be trifled with. He was a threat to the small, precious, vulnerable child they saw her as. Cage smiled and readily suggested an alternative, a picnic. But Leona had already made her choice. She had to see this enemy, learn more, and, if necessary, destroy it. She didn't mind taking risks, not with guards like Nikhil, Cage, or even Harriet. The princess knew she would not be easy prey. She had already seen the way. This chance could not be missed. Determination flashed in her eyes. A witch does not submit to other people's plans. A smile, sharp as a blade, slowly appeared on her lips. She would definitely find a way to get there. Harriet stood there as if transfixed, unable to believe his ears. He had barely left the Palace of the Black Rose when Nikhil caught up with him and repeated Leona's words. And what he heard seemed to make no sense to him. His lips twisted into a crooked smile. He looked as if he had heard a stupid joke. He shook his head in disbelief. What kind of liar was he to make up such a thing? Nikhil assured her that everything he said was not a joke, and not for himself. It was all for Leona's sake. This silenced Harriet. The girl, still so young, should believe in love. Why was she pushing her away? Probably because. He thought about it. The absence of her mother must have hurt her to this day. She was not loved at home. Her mother had died long ago, and her father was cold and distant. Her siblings had become rivals, not allies, in the struggle for the throne. She had grown up in the shadow of struggle and emptiness. And what was he, Harriet, to do about it? Nikhil, meanwhile, had a new question. Should he tell his mother, the fourth empress? Maybe even arrange a meeting with Leona? Harriet didn't understand why. And Nikhil only suggested that perhaps his mother would find Leona cute. Harriet's hand slowly moved to her forehead. He looked at the prince with pity and weariness that bordered on irritation. What to do with someone who sees the world through rose-colored glasses? Nikhil took it as a compliment. But Harriet immediately dispelled the illusion. No, that's not praise. That's a reproach. He couldn't help but call the prince an idiot. The prince was outraged, but Harriet was unmoved. The reminder of the obvious was harsh but fair. Leona was not an ally. She must become an enemy. So why does Nikhil visit her palace day after day? Has he forgotten the rules? And does he really think the Empress will look at Leona with the same eyes as he does? But even more so, it would be good if she just left her alive. This hurt. Nikhil raised his voice, defending his mother. But Harriet was not going to back down. There was only one conclusion. It was better not to even mention it to her. Finally, Nikhil asked what to do then. Harriet turned to him and firmly answered. He would simply give Leonie all his love. Boundless, infinite, the kind that fills the heart to the brim. Stepping onto the soft, barely whispering grass beneath her feet, she noticed a flower patch. The black roses that bloomed in this palace created a strange atmosphere, somber, like the shadow of an ineffable memory. Nikhil sighed every time he came here, and Harriet once even suggested planting forsythia. But she forbade it. No flower suited her better than these black roses. Their scent tickled the nose, making one shudder, and the dark mana that permeated the space became palpable with every breath. Why did she sense mana here? Even Cage couldn't detect it. Maybe that would be worth thinking about later. It didn't matter right now. Her body rose into the air. Her hands trembled. She was not yet used to the mana. But with such short legs, rapid movement was only possible this way. Cage had lightly touched her arm during their walk, and it was at that moment that the girl had cast a sleep spell. The 3-year-old's body had limited energy, so the spell would last less than an hour. We must hurry. The banquet will not wait. Her body leaned forward, and she accelerated, gliding through the air. No one would notice her from afar, only if they came closer. The human body grew extremely slowly. A stallion could walk as soon as it was born, and she was only now learning to do so. And even that came at a high price. The wind was cold, her nose itched. How unfortunate. I even had to sneeze, too sincerely. I wiped my wet nose with my sleeve. A salty taste appeared on my lips. Irritation erupted in an involuntary sigh. Living in a child's body is a real hardship. For a witch who is over 300 years old, it is almost torture. Someday, everyone would bow down to her. When that time came, no one would dare call her cute. The word disgusted her. The magic disappeared, and she carefully lowered herself to the ground. Around her spread out a landscape she had never seen before. Everything seemed unfamiliar, no landmarks, and now there was only one question left. Where to go next? She wanted to ask for directions, but surprisingly, there was not a single living soul around. The sunlight was glaring at my eyes, reflecting off the pebbles beneath my feet. The pebbles were multicolored. They were laid out in a mosaic, a dragon with a massive body, outstretched wings, and sharp teeth. The old imperial phrase came to mind. Glory to the great empire. Asians, presumably, this is an image of the same old ruler. It all seemed excessive and out of place. So much useless pomp for the sake of one old dragon. And after all, he had been asleep for a long time and would never see anything again. Leona moved closer. The mosaic was surrounded by a magical barrier that was supposed to raise an alarm if touched. Removing it required force, evidently the hand of a 4th level or higher magician. But she did not doubt her own abilities. Having uttered a spell, she removed the barrier and straightened up with an inner sense of triumph. Without hesitation, she stepped onto the colored surface. The mosaic became a toy. The stones shifted one by one, distorting the contours. No one would see it anyway. The old dragon was asleep. And it wasn't done out of anger or protest, it was just boring. The class was completely captivating. Her whole body moved in the rhythm of cheerful mischief. She didn't notice a shadow fall over her. Someone was standing nearby. Her gaze slowly rose from the ground. A familiar face, full of calm but unbearable power, looked at her. It was the Emperor. The Emperor appeared suddenly, cold and impassive as always. Leona responded with a dazzling smile, the kind that usually made adults clutch their hearts. But this time there was no reaction. Nothing in him shuddered. His gaze remained indifferent, like a statue carved from ancient stone. The Emperor released a wave of power, and a cold sweat ran down Leona's back. Her body shuddered reflexively, and her throat went dry. He became curious. He must have noticed the changes. Maybe he even recognized that the princess had become stronger. Something familiar flashed in that look. It was the same look he had had when they first met. Then he, too, suddenly touched her hand and gave her mana, roughly, sharply, with a pain that pierced her bones. She sincerely hoped that this time he would hold back. Harriet's voice. For the first time, his indignation was so loud. He was approaching quickly, agitated, offended, and clearly irritated. He didn't like the fact that the Emperor had left without him. Harriet was convinced that he should have waited until his shirt was ironed. But all his complaints suddenly stopped when he noticed Leona. The surprise in his eyes turned to admiration. He paused, then began to whisper something, looking at her in a hazy way. Her very presence seemed to make him lose control of his thoughts. He even started talking to himself. Every time she saw him, he seemed a little crazier. And yet, inadequate as he was, he instantly understood the point. He asked why she was here. He was surprised that Cage was nowhere to be found. Leona calmly reported that she had fallen asleep. Harriet immediately understood that she had run away, and not just for no reason, but to sneak into a memorable banquet. This was unacceptable to him. He tried again to ruin her plans. His face darkened. He had already decided he would immediately call someone to take the princess back. The Emperor interrupted Harriet, and she stopped sulking. He raised a finger and pointed at her, asking about the person next to her. Leona touched her finger in disbelief. Was he really talking about her? And so it was. She turned out to be the 12th princess sent by the Emperor to choose the sword. And it was she who chose the necromancer for the role. Even after explaining, Harriet seemed confused and as if he couldn't remember what was said. Leona was disappointed. She had been thinking about the Emperor day and night, and he hadn't even mentioned it. She puffed out her cheeks and looked at him with irritation. It hurt because she really cared about him. The Emperor looked at her with a smile that was hard to read. His voice was laced with a strong magic that made Leona wary. He must have warned her not to be silly, but she wasn't going to give up so easily. The princess responded with a smile, saying her name, Leona. Although she hid it, she felt Harriet clutch her chest, and she tried to maintain the sweetest smile she could. She had to look like a child. There was no other choice. She was going to a birthday party, but she got lost, and now she was sitting here, alone. The sense of loss of dignity from playing the role of a little girl was oppressive, but it was never easy with the Emperor. He constantly caused her problems, and her body seemed to freeze in his presence. Leona knew it was dangerous to tease him, so she had to be careful. It would be good if he showed a little fatherly love while she smiled at him. He doesn't intend to kill her for being a witch, does he? She hoped so. After all, Leona had to win his favor, even if only a little. Luckily, her baby face was cute enough to confuse anyone. People could really faint from such cuteness. Leona already had a plan to take advantage of it. The first victim was Harriet. He was about to die from too much tenderness. When Harriet came out of her trance, he put his arm around her shoulders and told her that the Emperor was her father. At first, Leonie found this incredible, and she doubted it. But the advisor insisted, advising them to address him as father or dad. He even fell to his knees, trying to arouse the Emperor's reaction, but he remained cold and indifferent. She slowly raised her hand and repeated the words that echoed in her mind. She was going to a holiday and asking her father to take her with him. It was more than a request. It was the hope that Leona held in all her thoughts. The princess flashed her eyes, certain that this would surely break any resistance. But the Emperor coldly declared that she could not come. He walked past without turning around. It was a refusal, cruel and merciless. Leona froze, staring at her receding back. How could such a heartless person exist? Such cruelty seemed impossible. Harriet watched her intently, not hiding her anxiety. She rushed after the emperor, confident in her abilities, but too self-confidently, and slipped. The fall was hard, the rocky ground scraping his hands and knees. The advisor jumped to the princess in fright when he noticed the blood on his knees. She sat there, scraping her skin against a pebble, feeling dirty like something broken. Harriet, moved, suggested that they take her to a healer immediately, leaning forward, ready to offer his back. But Leona just shook her head. That wasn't what she needed. She didn't want to be left alone. He looked at her in surprise, as if he had seen real pain for the first time. The emperor asked if she was in pain. It hurt, to the point of tears, to the point of wanting to fall face down on the ground and burst into tears. But she held back. He hates weakness. Even if she's still a child, she can't cry. Lynn had once said that tears were only allowed when one was completely exhausted. When the emperor lifted her to his eye level, she froze. It seemed as if the body had lost weight. He asked how she had removed the barrier. Her cheeks turned pale for a moment. Her breathing stopped. Leona tried to put on an innocent expression of surprise, as if she didn't understand what he was talking about. But he was persistent. How did she get to the mosaic? The princess tried to answer evasively, mentioning the stone image of the white bird, but she understood that he could see through her. A wave of panic ran through her body. She pretended to pout and made an innocent face. He silently moved closer. She wanted to scream that it hurt, that she could barely hold on, that she was about to faint. But instead, he suddenly smiled. The emperor said that she could not die here, and therefore she must follow him. So she conquered him? Yes, of course. How could one resist such charm? She rushed after him. She called her father loudly, and then, exhausted, she complained of pain in her legs. She grabbed the edge of his cloak, asking him to carry her. The expression on the emperor's face, so cold as usual, finally changed. Harriet gasped in confusion as she saw Leona pull back the emperor's cloak and beg him to take her in his arms. He was scared. Who knew how the emperor would react to such audacity? He cautiously offered to carry her himself, taking a step forward. But Leona resolutely pushed him away, clinging even tighter to her father. She declared that she would not let go until he took her. Harriet felt sad. People usually avoid the emperor. Even princes are cautious, but maybe she's just sad. She must be missing the warmth so much after her mother died. Her hand ached, her fingers numb, but she didn't give in. She wanted to scream for him to finally have mercy. She was sure that if he wasn't pushing her away, then all was not lost. And maybe she should be a little more direct. Leona gave him a bright look, full of sadness and stubbornness. She complained of pain in her legs, hinting that she could no longer walk. Then she loudly asked to be picked up, full of childish persistence. Her fighting spirit did not fade, but her body was tiring more and more quickly. And just at the moment when it became truly sad, someone's warm hands picked her up. The girl's eyes widened. The emperor's chest was warm. His hands were strong but careful. However, the only thing that was going through her mind was the feeling of victory. She had succeeded. She had truly won. From now on, even the emperor himself belonged to her. Wasn't he her supporter? She smiled, and he looked back at her. Harriet watched the scene in silence. He found it hard to believe that the emperor was holding a child. He felt short of breath. He wanted to run over, pick up Leona, make sure she was okay. But the emperor was silent, and then Harriet noticed something strange. A faint smile on his face. Had he really changed? Hope quietly settled in Harriet's chest. He couldn't stand it anymore. He ran after the emperor. Ebec's birthday was to go flawlessly. Not a single flaw, not a single frail gesture. Everything had to be precise to the millimeter. After all, the prince was not just a child. He was Ebec, precise, cold, demanding. The senior maid ordered more flowers to be arranged, although everything was already shining. And as soon as they had finished, he appeared in the doorway, a fair-haired prince. He looked around the room with a sharp and cutting gaze. Then he stepped to the table, pulled out a measuring tape, and checked the distances. Something didn't add up. His eyebrows drew together in a stern line. The maids froze. It was scary to even breathe. He snapped his fingers. They bowed their heads, ready to fix everything, but the tension didn't subside. Nikhil entered the hall. He stopped his younger brother, reminding him that today was not the time for bloody scenes. Ebec threw his hand away, but stopped. The maids, holding their breath, were allowed to return to work. The tension subsided, but not completely dissipated. Nikhil, watching his brother, half-jokingly said that with that look on his face, he would run into someone's knife. Ebec ironically replied that he himself was capable of that. They both smiled, but tension was already building between them. Ebec spoke of the Black Rose Palace. He mentioned the 12th princess, the child he apparently planned to invite. Nikhil did not hide his anxiety. Ebec smiled slyly, as if he knew exactly what he had offended his brother with. In response, the latter half-seriously threatened to kill him right then and there. Magic flared in the air. Nikhil's hands lit up with the sun god's light, and blue sparks danced around Ebec. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the maids fled. And then the one who knew how to stop storms entered the room. The brothers' gazes froze. In the ruler's arms was a child. Not just anyone, the 12th princess. And then silence hung in the air. Something tender flickered in Nikhil's gaze. He looked at her silently. A familiar nickname popped into his head. The inner voice confidently repeated it in his mind. Bunny! On the way to the second palace of the princes, she couldn't help but yawn and hid her face in the emperor's warm chest. The realization that being in this state wasn't the worst option came unexpectedly. She used to do everything herself. Then she lost faith in people who betrayed her over and over again, so she turned away from everyone. But despite this, loneliness scared her, so much so that she allowed one person to destroy her. This would not happen again. There was plenty of strength, but the body was still too weak. I had to rely on others. The mana sealed within the soul itself retained its original power, but the body could not yet withstand it. It would grow stronger and would no longer need outside help. Then she would show her true power to these weak people, and to Lacus. She would become Empress, which would give her all the power she needed for revenge. It was his name that irritated her the most. I wanted to know what was happening to him now. I was interested in news from that kingdom. I wanted to understand how much time had passed since her last death. Although, judging by the Emperor's age, not much had passed. Harriet accompanied them and seemed to be trying to joke. His smile only aroused disgust. The Emperor's assistant remained a mystery to her, to which she did not want to seek an answer. When they reached the entrance to the banquet hall, they were greeted by servants. The air around them trembled with powerful mana. The skin was covered with ants. Something was happening inside. She looked up and saw Nikhil. On the opposite side stood the other one, with icy strength that resembled the Emperor's. I wish I had one like that. The boys were fighting, and the spectacle seemed funny. She giggled softly. Harriet stood in front of her, blocking her view. He explained that the mana could be harmful, and looked at her intently. The look irritated him. Couldn't he see that there was a real fight inside? The next moment, the Emperor leaned over her, touched her chin. Harriet commented on his concern. But the Emperor remained silent, only covering her with his body, as if protecting her from danger. It wasn't necessary. She wasn't weak. At least, no weaker than those boys who played at battle. The advisor said it was better to avoid risks. But she resisted, trying to see again what had been hidden from her. But the Emperor's hands held her tightly. It was impossible to escape. Harriet promised to stop the fight. And indeed, the flow of mana suddenly stopped. She looked around the hall with interest again. Everyone around was stunned by the force with which the Emperor stopped the children's quarrel. Suddenly, someone began to touch her shoulders. The movements were soft, soothing. Her muscles relaxed, and she felt extremely light. She burst into laughter, quiet, happy. The Emperor smiled at her. The smile seemed warm, not mocking, not reserved, just human. She smiled back wider, and he did the same. The moment was calm, almost cozy. Nikhil's voice. She turned her head. His face was stony, his eyes frightened. He asked something about Leona, about her, as if he feared the worst. The boy's fists clenched. There was a strange, unfounded anxiety in his words. She sighed inwardly. What a senseless theater! And she simply covered her face with her hand, tired of the absurdity. Harriet clutched her stomach, and burst into loud laughter. His shoulders shook, tears rolled down his cheeks. But Nikhil froze, as if he had seen something terrible. His face twisted in horror. While Harriet tried to stop her uncontrollable laughter by wiping her eyes, Leona lay peacefully in the Emperor's arms. Ebec watched her silently, his gaze shifting from her father to the girl. The boy's face wore a look of surprise and tension. He addressed the Emperor in a formal tone, inviting him to sit down. He nodded, showing no emotion, and looked back at Leona in his arms. She returned his gaze, calm, even trusting. The idea of putting her on the ground seemed logical, but another thought flashed through the Emperor's mind. He should not show excessive affection for any one of the children. However, Leona had already begun to straighten up, saying she was ready to go down, even though she didn't want the Emperor to go. In exchange, she demanded one thing, that next time she too be carried in her arms, as if making a deal. Those present in the hall shuddered at what they heard. Her sincerity was touching, but Leona paid no attention to the reaction. She held out her hands to the Emperor, as if that were enough. Nikhil, still shocked, whispered the question he couldn't help but voice. "Does the Emperor really like the rabbit?" Harriet smiled, watching the scene, and nodded. The next moment, another question was asked. "How much exactly?" Harriet thought for only a moment before answering. Of course, this affection cannot compare to the love they themselves feel. But Nikhil thought for a moment, then nodded slightly. It pleased him to think that he and his father had something in common. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. Some guests were ignored. Second Prince Ebec narrowed his eyes as his relatives, the other princes and members of the imperial family, walked past him as if he didn't exist. The newly arrived brothers and sisters stood there uncertainly, not knowing how to behave. And Ebec just watched, from beginning to end, in silence. A memory flashed through his mind. His father had never looked at any of his children like that. The Emperor had never known how to care. He had never shown any care or warmth. So what exactly makes this girl stand out? What has earned her so much attention? Now not only Nikhil and Harriet, but the Emperor himself took this poor princess into his arms, the former parentless, the former draw. His hands, which had always remained aloof, suddenly touched her shoulders. Ebec kept his eyes on Leona. His thoughts were becoming sharp. Maybe that day had come. Maybe today was the day to kill her. It's simple. Her father is just indulgent towards her. Nothing more. His principles remain unchanged. He doesn't interfere in the struggle for the throne, and won't flinch if one of his children dies. Ebec already had other plans for today, but there was no good reason not to include one more item in them: the death of the princess. Eventually, he snapped out of his stupor and hurried back to his seat. Meanwhile, the official voice of the Master of Ceremonies was already heard in the hall, announcing the beginning of the celebration in honor of the second prince's birthday. However, Ebec did not hear a word. His attention was focused on the 12th princess, who was sitting opposite and peering intently at the cutlery. Leona's gaze focused on the fork, and Ebec watched her intently. He paused for a moment, wondering if she had guessed the poison he had put on the tines. Meanwhile, the princess was doing the math in her head. The fork was made of silver, so it could be worth a lot. She was already imagining how she would sell it and get the money. Ebec tried to calm himself. The poison was odorless, colorless, almost invisible. It was created for just such cases, but panic was mounting. If the silver reacted with the substance, it would leave a dark stain on the surface. His fear became a reality. The tips of the fork did indeed darken. He watched as Leona picked up her fork, but quickly threw it back on the table. She didn't suspect anything, just reached impatiently for the cutlery, imagining how much money she could make for it. The Emperor sat at the head of the table, Leona next to Nikhil, directly opposite Ebec. Her gaze accidentally met the prince's. There was hostility in his eyes. She realized that she was hated for being too close to the Emperor. Everyone in the hall probably remembered how she sat calmly in his arms, but she didn't care. She laughed as if it really didn't matter, and reached for the apples. Hunger forced her to look away. She was reaching for the fruit when it fell from her hands and clattered to the floor. A dull sound echoed in the hall. Ebec clenched his fist and slammed it on the table. The Master of Ceremonies' voice cut off, but the prince heard nothing more. His mind was completely consumed by fear. It seemed to him that Leona suspected something about the apples as well. He couldn't let her go. He whistled, and a wind rose in the hall. The hidden assassins emerged from the shadows. The guards and servants didn't have time to react. They were immediately pushed aside. Everyone in the hall froze. Ebec raised his hand and pointed sharply at the princess. His voice sounded cold. A child who can't even resist should simply disappear. He was already turning away, confident of victory, when his gaze met the emperor's. At that moment, he felt as if he had made a fatal mistake. The second prince did not warn anyone. He simply ordered the attack without a word. The emperor, as always, showed neither surprise nor indignation. Ruthless, indifferent. That's how everyone was used to seeing him, but he didn't notice it himself, as he had already taken a step. His hand involuntarily raised, and the arrows aimed at Leona were deflected to the side without causing any harm. Leona looked up, staring at his face in surprise. Nearby, Ebec also froze. He did not expect the emperor to come to the princess's defense. His lips moved. He tried to say something, but he couldn't find the words. The emperor took a slow breath. His gaze remained unwavering. And only later, as if listening to his own thoughts, did he say, "Every heir has the right to protection only when he has the sword with him." The princess came without it. Ebec turned his gaze to Leona. She had indeed appeared alone, unarmed, and they had taken advantage of that. The attack had only been possible because of the sword's absence. The prince had vanished. He hadn't noticed, he hadn't taken into account. Everything happened too quickly. The killers, not having achieved their goal, turned back to him. Their gazes awaited a new order. Ebec, unable to find a way out, silently admitted that there was nothing he could do with Leona at the moment. But that wasn't the end. With a wave of his hand, he ordered the attack on the other heirs. The assassins' gazes changed direction. The emperor remained where he was, as if he hadn't seen his son direct death at his own family. Leona watched in silence. Then she carefully touched the emperor's robes. Her gaze was serious, her voice barely audible. She leaned closer, whispered, asking for help for Nikhil. He could barely stand on his feet. The killers were squeezing the ring around him, and the wounds on his body were already bleeding. His leg was dislocated, and he moved with pain. Leona turned to the emperor once more. Her voice trembled. If nothing was done, Nikhil would die. This time, Harriet stepped in. His usually calm face darkened. He wouldn't let the princess participate in the fight for the throne. His stance was unwavering, his voice tight with determination. Leona couldn't understand why she was the only one allowed to be saved while the others were left on the brink of death. Harriet mentioned Nikhil's sword. He had it, unlike her. But Leona only glanced in the direction the advisor pointed. There lay the lifeless body of the knight, and the sword far from its master. Her gaze flared with anger. Meanwhile, Nikhil, with his wounds and effort overcoming the pain, tried to reach Ebec. His movements were tense, confused. He lacked the strength to break through the dense crowd of killers that stood between him and his target. Leona felt something tighten inside her. Leaving him at such a moment seemed impossible. A powerful ally, a bearer of the power of the sun. Such a one could not be lost. Saving him meant preserving his chance for balance, but most of all, Leona couldn't let him die. His body fell to the floor. His shoulder was pierced, his movements slowed, blood dripping onto the marble. She had promised herself not to use force, but now that promise had lost its weight. Her fingers were already throbbing with heat. She just wanted to make a breakthrough, to release a fiery arrow, to force the enemies to retreat, to give them a chance to escape. But the moment the ice arrow flew towards Nikhil, something else happened. Her instinct fired first. Words burst from her lips, and energy flared from her palms. Powerful, red, destructive. The fireball destroyed the arrow and shattered the ranks of the assassins. Ebec flew back with force, barely holding on to his life. The emperor's gaze, Harriet's, Nikhil's, were all fixed on Leona. Her hands were still glowing, though she didn't even know how she had done it. It was third circle magic. She hadn't planned to use it. She had only intended to use an elemental spell, but it happened differently. It was instinct, to save. Nikhil rushed towards her, laughing, with blood on his cheek. His surprise and joy were overshadowed by fatigue. He was saying something, asking questions, trying to understand. And Leona just swallowed the emptiness in her throat. She couldn't explain anything that had happened. There was a crack in her eyes. She lied. She said she didn't know exactly how it happened, that she didn't want it. Her face remained calm, but her thoughts were racing. Nikhil didn't believe it. His gaze changed. Doubt and something wary appeared in it. But something stopped him. Not anger, but a strange sound of laughter. Someone in the hall was really laughing. The Emperor himself laughed at all this madness. His hand fell on Leona's head. Roughly, without tenderness, but in that movement there was still something hidden. Then he ordered someone called Zeros. Leona refrained from asking. In such cases, silence was wiser. The Emperor remembered the earlier ordeal. His gaze swept across the hall, where bodies still lay, blood spilled, and a plume of smoke. It was a familiar sight, and would probably become even more familiar in the future. But even with the habit, it remained disgusting. The Emperor left in silence, without words of support for his son, without reproach for the other, without regret. Harriet stood nearby. There was something close to pride mixed with despair on his face. His thumb slowly rose towards Leona. It was as if he was confirming. She really was incredible. On the way back to the main palace, Harriet walked with a satisfied look on his face. His gaze kept slipping towards the Emperor, as if he were waiting for confirmation of his own innocence. His suspicions were correct. The princess was indeed extraordinary. What she did amazed even him, although he suspected that she had great power hidden within her. And it didn't matter whether the Emperor himself admitted it or not. The result spoke for itself. The perfectly executed magic, pure and without a single mistake, amazed even his experienced eye. But time was running out. The return of the first prince was approaching, and Leonie would still have to find her place in this dangerous balance. Harriet had no doubt that the moment would come when the Emperor's support would be crucial, and she hoped that he would not remain on the sidelines. The Emperor thought for a moment. Something hard to discern flickered in his gaze. The thought of Leona still lingered in his mind, but he answered briefly and rather sharply. Harriet fell silent, bowing with a half-smile, as befitted a courtier. The Emperor had long known of the power of the princess's mana. When he first saw her, he had already felt something unusual. Perhaps he hadn't fully realized it then, but his surprise had awakened. The Emperor and Harriet had already left. Leona slowly crouched down in front of Nikhil, peering into his exhausted face. He was breathing heavily, blood had congealed in dark spots on his cheek. She knew he was seriously injured. His body looked broken. His face, though it tried to maintain a smile, was on the verge of losing consciousness. But, despite his condition, Nika tried to pull himself together. He reminded himself again that he had the power of the sun god, as if that would change anything. Leona only shrugged slightly. There was no admiration in her eyes. She watched him try to get up. He spread his arms wide, slowly pulled his knee up, and fell again. His body wouldn't obey, despite his will. She shook her head softly and pulled something out of her pocket that should help him. Touching his own nose suddenly brought back a sense of reality. He was still alive. And in that moment, he felt truly human. A shadow fell nearby. Leona slowly raised her head. Ebec stood before her, but he did not attack. Apparently, the Emperor, who had left them alone, had untied his internal bonds. He did not intend to fight. His body was also covered in scars and burns, evidently the effects of the fireball explosion. His shirt was bloodied on his chest. He said nothing, just looked at Leona. A brief moment of gratitude flashed in his eyes, cold and blue. He knew that he was only alive because of her. If it weren't for Leona's magic, Nikhil's light would have pierced his heart. Everything had turned out differently, and not through his own choice. He sighed. He knew they were both alive because of her, but he didn't understand why. Leona looked at him in surprise. Her thoughts were only on Nikhil. Obviously, Ebec had misunderstood everything. He asked if she was annoyed by their constant quarrels, and if she tried to convince the Emperor to stop it all. Leona didn't have time to answer, as he added, she hadn't touched the poison, just as he had guessed. The words about poison made her frown. She had no idea what he was talking about. He obviously took her silence in his own way. He squeezed her hand and apologized, saying he had lost too much mana. He seemed to be really sick. His lips turned white. His fingers trembled slightly. Suddenly, he pulled out something he had been hiding behind his back. He handed it to her. There was sincerity in his eyes. But in his hand was a severed hand, frozen with ice, without a single drop of blood. The cut was imperfect. The skin was torn. He continued, embarrassed, saying that next time he would give her something more carefully. Leona silently stared at the gift. Her eyes did not blink. A storm of disgust and confusion was brewing inside. But outside, there was silence. Leona was sitting in the room, her eyelids half closed, when she heard the familiar reproachful voice again. Lynn did not calm down. It had already been a week since the banquet in honor of the second prince's birthday, and she repeated the same question every day. Is Leona going somewhere? And every time with the same determination. The answers came confidently, then uncertainly, and finally with a promise. But Lynn didn't give up. Leona sighed inwardly. It was starting to annoy her, but she couldn't say it out loud. Because she remembered how Lynn had searched the entire imperial palace in tears when Leona had simply disappeared. A new question sounded in the silence. Lynn could feel her unease. Leona suddenly smiled to herself. She had not trusted people since childhood. If he dies, Lynn will be left without a gainful job. That is the whole reason for her worry. Lynn's voice interrupted her thoughts again. Leona looked up. The maid asked if she was tired of listening to her worries. Leona didn't have time to answer, as she contradicted herself. The late response betrayed indecision, and Leona's sincerity, which she hadn't even noticed, made Lynn laugh. She knelt down, touched her cheek with her fingers, and said she was truly worried. There was warmth in her eyes. Leona was surprised. She hadn't expected this. Lynn added that she didn't want anything to happen to Leona. She should live happily. Then she gently kissed her forehead, stood up, and announced that she was heading to the main palace to receive her payments. She asked me to stay home in peace. Leona just nodded silently. With Lynn's silhouette gone, the room became empty. She fell onto the bed and sighed. Doubts filled her mind again. Was Lynn sincere? She didn't want to trust again, because trust had already turned into betrayal more than once. But when Lynn hugged her, there was something maternal in her voice. And yet, Lynn had no reason to love her. Love always had its benefits. Jean admired the red hair and red eyes, but he hated her when the experiment failed. Lacus loved her for her title, and when he got the crown, he just forgot. Maybe now they only love her because she's a princess? Leona stood up abruptly. It was time to stop feeling sorry for herself. We had to hide and play our part well. She gathered her thoughts, not to laugh, not to scream, not to break down. Even though everyone knew she had magic, her days passed monotonously. She ate, slept, rested, and repeated it in a circle. Nikhil never appeared. He was recovering. Ebec came, leaving more strange gifts. The last one was a ring made of human fingers. She returned it, like the previous 12. And only then did he stop. Finally, he understood the hint. Leona found herself in complete freedom. She decided to take a walk past the wall of the black and pink palace, when she heard a strange voice. It is not known whether it was addressed to her, so she went further. But the voice insisted. Leona shuddered. Her hand gripped her temple, her head throbbed, as if from a sudden burst of magic. Leona stopped short at the sound of someone demanding attention. She slowly turned around and saw the child. It was the 8th Prince Eden, a brash, insufferable boy with a perpetual scowl. He had recently been brutally beaten by mercenaries who had infiltrated the prince's birthday party. Eden was lucky to survive, but the humiliation was unbearable, especially after everyone was talking about how the 12th princess saved the 4th, the little witch who supposedly created the fireball. It sounded like nonsense, but the rumors turned out to be true. Eden became even angrier. He hadn't heard that legendary voice of the genius magician, but his pride wouldn't let him accept the truth. Leona seemed alien to him, dangerous and vulnerable at the same time. Eden came closer, looking into her eyes from above. He tried to touch her. He demanded an answer. hinted at fear. But Leona remained silent, her head bowed. When the insults rained down with renewed force, she raised her hand. Her eyes became bloodshot. Something predatory and cold flashed in her gaze. The prince did not even have time to understand how he ended up on the ground, curled up in a ball. An ordinary man would have fled long ago, admitting defeat. But the princes of the empire were born with pride instead of intelligence. Eden straightened and straightened, trying again to appear strong. He created a flame, a tiny flash of anger and strength, but the fire was extinguished instantly. His spell had failed. Eden was confused. Smoke billowed in the air, and Leona was already watching him calmly. With a half smile, she felt funny. He is still too young to bear such anger, but he wants to be an adult. Pillars of fire rose around her, bright, blindingly white. Real fire is not the kind that smokes, but the kind that purifies. Eden involuntarily stepped back. His body betrayed him. He didn't move. He was paralyzed with fear. Leona raised her hand with the same look in which bloody pleasure appeared. She didn't intend to kill. She was playing. Another moment, and everything changed. She felt a strange energy, sharp, dark, as if the air were electrified. Someone was approaching. The powerful presence made her instantly extinguish the flame. Leona fell to her knees and slapped herself lightly on the cheek. Eden stared at her in shock. The scene was turning into a farce. He didn't understand what was happening. His mind was spinning. This child couldn't be crazy. She was too strong. Leona was enjoying the game. She rushed towards the figure that appeared nearby. It was the Emperor. She stared at his leg and raised her moist eyes to him. Complaints echoed on her lips. Eden was to blame for all the troubles. Leona really had intended to end Eden, but the Emperor showed up at the worst possible moment and ruined everything. Well, she'll have to turn that to her advantage. She lowered her head, shed a single tear, and sobbing softly, voiced her accusation. Her tears looked sincere, enough to fool anyone. But not his. It was the Emperor, a man who didn't believe in tears, even children's. Harriet's words flashed through his memory. He asked why he didn't want to see the princess. Didn't he think how sad she was? Didn't he imagine that she just wanted to hug her father? His gaze softened a little. Before him stood a child with eyes the color of ripe blood, pure as a lamb's. His heart suddenly sank. Those eyes had not yet learned to manipulate, at least not in the way adults could. This innocence confused him. And before he knew what he was doing, the Emperor had grabbed Leona by the neck and lifted her up. She only swallowed dryly. Her feet no longer touched the ground. Confusion flashed like lightning. What had happened? Had he seen what she was pretending? Maybe he had guessed? But instead of punishment, there was surprise. His arms wrapped around her, sharply, tightly, as if automatically. Leona blinked several times from surprise, trying to understand what was happening. However, this can also be used. She smiled to herself again. The finger pointed at Eden. The Emperor moved towards him slowly, step by step, and every step felt like a jolt to the ground. Eden trembled, his shoulders slumped. He kept his eyes on the floor. When the Emperor's voice finally rang out above him, he shuddered even more. Ebec almost uttered an apology, but all he heard in response was a mention of the ban. The Emperor had once forbidden him to engage in battle without proper weapons. Now he reminded him of this with icy restraint. Leona, not missing the opportunity, leaned her head against his chest. At that moment, everything looked convincing. Eden had disobeyed the order, and Leona had won, in her own way. Eden stood before the Emperor, seemingly stripped of his dignity, his knees touching the cold floor, and his forehead against the stone, as if he were trying to rub his guilt into the very earth. But the Emperor only glanced at Leona. There was neither anger nor mercy in his eyes, only an empty, silent question that hung between them. Did she enjoy this humiliation? Leona silently embraced the Emperor. Her small hand touched his cheek, touching and calm. A gesture that could move stone. She wanted more. A smile appeared on the Emperor's lips. It was not warm, but rather indulgent. The decision was made. The punishment was mild, almost symbolic. A week in solitary confinement. Eden was overcome. His lips trembled, and his eyes filled with unspoken tears. but he remained silent. It was impossible to resist the emperor. Everything inside was boiling: indignation, pain, humiliation. But outwardly, there was only silent agreement. He stood up and, with his head down, walked away. His steps were uncertain, and even the fabric of his trousers gave off an alarming dampness. Leona, looking after him, only mentally snorted. A fool, but now he might finally try to become stronger. She lightly patted the emperor on the back, thanking him for his support. However, her release did not come. The emperor did not let go of her. He held her in his arms and moved on, as if she were not a child but part of his intention. Leona's gaze sit upward. The emperor, calmly walking through the palace corridors, suddenly spoke. His question sounded cautious, almost uncertain. Why had she saved the fourth prince? Her eyes rolled. She hadn't planned on explaining, but the emperor waited silently. There was no room for mercy in this family. Everyone walked over corpses. It wasn't those who helped who survived, but those who struck first. The emperor knew this better than anyone. That's why it was hard for him to believe that Leona had done it selflessly. She answered clearly: knowledge, strength. She shared all this with Nikhil. He was her figure on the field, just one of many. The emperor met her gaze. Her eyes no longer seemed pure. They held lies and cunning. His brow wrinkled slightly. The memory of their previous encounter prompted a new question. Why was she hiding her true abilities? Leona bit her lip. Her answer was straightforward. She was preparing to create her own power. Nikhil is part of her army. The emperor froze. For the first time, he heard that this little creature had something it considered its own, and that it was not a whim, but a people, her responsibility. He repeated the question. Her answer was brief. Yes, the pillar of fire was her thing. But she wasn't strong enough to protect her own, so she had to hide her skills for now. The emperor thought for a moment. Perhaps Leona didn't fully understand what it meant to protect, but she did. She understood, and to her it meant one thing: not letting her people suffer. The emperor said nothing more. He simply moved forward. Leona, slightly surprised, looked around. Where were they going? To the main palace. There, a meeting awaited her. Although the emperor would have preferred that not to happen. On the windowsill, by the window, sat a man, smiling slyly and watching the sky. This was Zeros, the lord of the West Tower. His black hair fluttered in the wind, and his skin seemed almost transparent. His golden eyes, heavy as jewels, swayed beneath long lashes. Harriet often thought he was a woman, but he was not. He was a hard, cold creature, capable of breaking the heart of any woman on the continent. And that was why Harriet was worried. Who knew what he would do to the princess? Zeros was too far from humans, but he had the power to determine the princess's magical potential. And although it would have been better to avoid this meeting, there was no other option. When Zeros finally spoke, his voice was tinged with irritation. They were running late. Harriet consoled herself. Perhaps the visit would be cancelled? But Zeros only smiled slyly. He had not yet lost interest. Finally, the door opened. The emperor and princess entered. Harriet immediately showered them with greetings. The emperor replied with boredom. And Zeros only squinted. His gaze fell on the figure in the emperor's arms. It was a small creature, a princess. Zeros slowly reached out his hand towards Leona, as if he wanted to touch her essence, not just her body. His movement was unexpectedly direct, causing the emperor to freeze with a confused expression on his face. He didn't seem to expect such a quick initiative from the Lord of the Magic Tower. But Zeros only gave a cursory explanation, as if he were talking about a normal procedure. He was invited to assess the princess's strength, and so he tries to do it. And if the child's potential proves sufficient, she will become his apprentice. That word, student, scorched Leona like a hot iron. Her body froze. Her gaze hardened. To be his student, without her consent? She could barely contain her indignation. Everything inside protested, as if this was not just a compulsion, but a threat to her very being. Off to the side, Harriet, not reading the general tension, casually raised 2 fingers up, as if supporting the game. He said, "It's going well. Keep it up." But for Leona, it wasn't a game. Being around Zeros meant taking risks. Her true identity could be exposed. The prospect wasn't just frightening, it was destroying everything she had worked so hard to build. Zeros was surprised. He hadn't expected such an emotional reaction. In fact, he hadn't even said he was accepting her as an apprentice yet. The decision hadn't been made. He was just gathering data. The princess tilted her head in annoyance. Could she be underqualified? His answer was simple. Yes. She may not meet the criteria. At that moment, the Emperor intervened. His voice was cold, commanding. The Tower Master should step aside. But Zeros did not consider it necessary to submit. He was not going to back down. And he had already decided for himself. The assessment would take place anyway, with or without permission. The magician's gaze was fixed on the girl. Something in his eyes was changing, deepening. He silently concluded that he would not find out what he needed in any other way. And then a command sounded, spoken almost in a whisper. Stop time! Space shuddered. A powerful flow of mana struck in a wave, as if the air itself were being split. Space froze. Time stopped. Harriet, the Emperor, everyone around them froze in immobility like dolls without strings. Only two remained outside this viscous silence, Zeros and Leona. She looked around in horror. Everything around her froze in a bizarre scene of a silent theater. Zeros remained calm. His voice was low, almost intimate. There was something he had to ask personally. The question was simple, straight to the heart. Who is she really? And at that moment, the girl's chest went cold. Leona felt her heart clench in her chest. She suspected Zeros knew something. Her face broke into a fake smile as she theatrically announced her name. However, this was not enough for him. The magician's gaze remained distrustful. Words did not work. Attempts to feign naivety failed one after another. Each sentence was reflected against the wall of indifference. Zeros did not believe it, and did not hide it. He approached, lowered his face so that only breath remained between us. Softly, but clearly, he remembered the fallen state, the Eskin Empire, captured by Cassis. All members of the imperial family had the same color of soul. Leona held her breath for a moment. Her smile faded, her gaze became sharp, and yet she tried to maintain a mask of frivolity. He asked about her age. She replied absurdly, 3 years. His patience snapped. The next moment he grabbed her wrist. His mana, warm, golden, suddenly entered her body. He didn't ask anymore. He found out for himself, and it seemed he understood everything. Her soul was too ancient for this body. Panic gripped Leona. How did he know? Even the Emperor didn't suspect anything, and this smiling bastard exposed her in a matter of minutes. Zeros spoke again, calmly, softly, as if whispering something pleasant. His voice had a magnetic power. He offered help, but the price sounded too strange. An empty body for a soul, or something else. His options sounded like sweet poison. Leona listened silently while his smile grew, as if he was already certain of his agreement. But instead of answering, she quickly grabbed his hand and shouted an incantation. An electric spark ran through his body. Zeros flinched and jumped back. Leona stood up, despite her weakness. The temporary barrier created around her began to crack. The mage looked too young, but he acted like an ancient. His laughter was uncontrollable, even as Leona shivered from the searing pain. She felt her inner structure crack. His invasion was too deep. The gates of her soul opened, and her body, so small and imperfect, could not withstand it. When the time spell was lifted, Harriet rushed to her first. His voice was filled with anxiety. But Leona only shook her head. She was sick, but she was still holding on. The Emperor did not hide his rage. His anger was palpable even without words. Leona could barely contain herself. She wanted to scream. Can't he see that she's on the verge? That damned body of a 3-year-old child almost flew into pieces, and Zeros looked like he had just had a cup of tea. The magician just shrugged, as if nothing had happened. He remembered that he had used time magic, and made a light-hearted joke. The Emperor demanded an explanation. Zeros answered calmly, as if assessing the situation. The princess's magical power was powerful, but her control was insufficient. She needed training, his training. Leona flared up. What? Does this smug guy want to teach her? Ishiflet refused. She wouldn't be his student. No way. With anyone but him. Harriet cautiously sided with her. It was no use forcing a princess. The emperor agreed. The choice was hers. But Zeros was not about to give up. He silently turned his head to Leona, and with a movement of his lips, uttered a phrase that only she understood. Something changed in her face. She cringed inside. This scumbag was seriously hinting that he would reveal her secret. A moment of silence. And the answer. She agreed. With a changed intonation, with force, as if she had swallowed poison, she smiled. And Zeros smiled again. This time like a winner. His tone was exquisitely polite. From now on, he said, he would take care of her, Princess Leona. Nikhil, the fourth prince of the empire, rubbed his waist with a grimace on his face. His back ached. His body had not yet fully recovered from his long illness. But his thoughts were not about himself. He was tormented by longing. He had not been able to sleep properly since Leona had disappeared. Even with his eyes closed, he could see her face, her plump cheeks, her eyes like two precious stones. And when he opened his eyes, she was standing before him again in his memories. He longed to see her, to look into her face, to touch her at least, to pinch her cheek like he had done before. He imagined how surprised she would be. Maybe she'll be offended, but she'll forgive me. She's a rabbit, and rabbits don't hold grudges. Despite the maid's warnings, he set off. He walked slowly at first, then faster and faster. He passed the walls of the 8th Prince's palace until he turned the corner and stopped. In front of him, squatting, sat Ebec. There was no surprise on his face. It was as if he knew that Nikhil would appear. He sat down next to him, at first jokingly, but quickly fell silent. Before him was Eden. Dead rabbits lay around him. Their small bodies were motionless, and between them red lights burned dimly. One of the rabbits looked too much like someone. Nikhil flared with anger. He couldn't breathe easy when he saw it. He was boiling inside. His body was shaking. Flames flared around him, hot, unstoppable. He stamped his feet, shouted, rushed forward. His hands trembled with rage. Ebec sat silently next to him. Another servant stood nearby. He lowered his head as he spoke, carefully, almost in a whisper. But Eden became even angrier. His gaze was piercing, his voice rough and contemptuous. He remembered being left alone, with only profit sought from him. Everyone was to blame, even this silent subordinate. His order was clear and ruthless. Kill, right now. Bring the head of the 12th princess. No delay, no questions asked. His eyes were burning with madness. The voice echoed loudly in the narrow passage between the palace walls. Nikhil and Ebec heard every word. They exchanged silent glances. Both different, but now the same. Their silence was eloquent. Their gaze was serious. For the first time, their thoughts coincided. Ebec had spoken what had long been hanging in the air, a temporary alliance. They nodded. They gritted their teeth. Their anger, so different in nature, was now directed at Eden, and this time they acted together. Leona leaned against the balcony railing, as if trying to stay afloat as the memories dragged her down. Deep breaths did not ease the weight of the day. As soon as she stepped over the threshold of the palace, Lin met her with a piercing gaze and a tired confession. Everyone was in pain except her. But Lin still had the strength to hold on, albeit fragile. Leona felt the exhaustion roll in waves. She sighed again, long, soundlessly. The day seemed too colorful. A fight with the 8th prince, the embrace of the emperor, a meeting with that strange stranger who seemed to be a magician. Her soul, so alien to this world, did not go unnoticed. Fortunately, her real name remained a secret. Even Zeros, as far as she knew, had no idea that he was the Fire Witch. Perhaps it was best to just pretend that nothing had happened. Pretend that everything is normal, that she is like everyone else. And then, maybe, it won't become a threat. She looked at the sky and remembered. Hair as black as night, the cold silence that always followed. And at that moment, a sharp burst of thought. Someone spoke, so unexpectedly that she shuddered. Zero stood nearby. Where had he come from? She hadn't even noticed him approaching. His presence was sudden, like the echo of an ancient dream. Leona glared at him in disbelief. Somehow she had the feeling that she must grow up faster than time allowed. Her eyes flashed. She glanced in the direction of the stranger. His reaction was unmoved. He studied her silently, a little mockingly. He felt as if he were being looked at, as if he were a strange bug. Zeros's eyes turned red, but not from anger, more from fatigue or overwork. She didn't want to listen to his chatter anymore and told him to leave. But he hadn't come just for that. His words were soft, almost awkward. He confessed that he just wanted to see her before he disappeared. He was curious about who she was, but Leona had nothing to say, and yet he promised to stay by her side, without demands, without price tags, just to be, to support. He knelt down to her level and smiled. It was a warm smile, if a little sly. He suggested they be friends. She just shook her head, wary. She had no intention of playing or opening up, but he took her hand, unexpectedly gently, and told her that the time would come when she would turn to him. He asked for only one thing: care. But that moment was enough for Cage to appear. Her appearance was as sharp as a sword strike. Seeing the stranger touch the princess's hand, she dropped the accusation and drew her weapon. Swords flew at Zeros like a hail of arrows. He dodged, hovered in midair, cast his magic, and responded dryly, but with dignity. If this happens again, there will be no leniency. Leona sighed, for the third time that evening. She looked with disgust at the two figures who had put on a show before her eyes. And she thought that peace was a luxury that no longer existed in this palace. Leona frowned and took a few steps forward, standing in front of Cage, her back to her. Her gaze locked on Zeros, calm but sharp as a blade. She silently assessed both of them. Cage had done his job, impeccably, as always. But Zeros, he had achieved his goal. He had attracted attention. He had left his mark. And yet he couldn't stop, as if he wanted the last word. The magician's face changed. Something soft appeared in his features, a faint hint of tenderness. His gaze on Leona was warm, almost gentle. Unnaturally gentle, considering the circumstances. But her response was sharp, and at the same time playful. A suggestion, half jokingly, to give him a chance to learn more. Maybe too bold. Maybe too reckless. Zeros responded with his usual theatricality. He would have liked to linger, but Cage's presence seemed to weigh him down. Her hostility was too obvious, and he decided to retreat, temporarily. A whirlwind swirled beneath his feet, fast, fierce, as if carved from the elements. It engulfed the magician completely, and in an instant it was gone. The wind dissipated with it. He disappeared without a trace. No hint of presence, no shadow, only silence. Leona raised her hand, as if to touch the emptiness left behind by him. But something was troubling her. There was something familiar about this boy. Too familiar. But no matter how hard I tried to remember, my memory failed me. Everything was shrouded in fog. Surprise slowly gave way to anxiety. The princess crossed her arms over her chest, sighing softly. Her inner voice found no answer. Cage stood silently behind her. But her voice was clear and unwavering when the question finally came. Her guardedness did not disappear. Leona raised her head and looked at her, answering simply, "A mage, the Tower Master, her mentor." This did not satisfy Cage. A barely noticeable change in the warrior's face betrayed doubts. Leona tilted her head, watching the reaction, and was surprised. It turned out that Cage knew nothing about the magic tower. It was strange, and disturbing at the same time. When Cage called Zeros crazy, and perhaps more powerful than the king himself, Leona froze. Undisguised surprise appeared in her eyes. Cage remembered the battle on the plains of Carell, the one when the Cassis Empire stood its ground against the Eastern power. Only one dead on the side of the Empire. Ani! And tens of thousands on the enemy. An unspeakable victory that became a legend. And this power, did it belong to Zeros? Leona felt her confidence waver. She had recently learned to control magic. She felt a power within her, but it seemed like it would never be enough. Cage, not hiding her determination, asked if she was allowed to kill the mage next time. Leona replied sharply. Zeros was her teacher, and she would not allow anything more. Mech didn't object, But her words about the pervert made Leona roll her eyes. She hissed sternly, trying to suppress a wave of irritation. This conversation was already tiring. Night fell over the palace again, but the feeling of peace never returned. The next day, the long sitting took its toll. Her body became stiff, and Leona, stretching slowly, felt a brief sense of relief. The tension in her shoulders eased, her breathing became more even. Her mana was like a quiet current, flowing slowly to the center of her soul. Not yet perfect, still unstable, but better than yesterday. She started the day early. She left the chambers with Cage to practice. Now that her magic was officially known, and the Emperor no longer demanded silence, she could practice openly, without shadows or fear. Raku's betrayal, everything could have been different, but he chose the path of the enemy. And someday, even if it's 10 years from now, Leona will get her revenge. She slowed her breathing and closed her eyes again. She tried to concentrate. Her body had 5-star potential, enough to create up to 5 magic circles. But in such a young body, drastic attempts were only exhausting. So she did something different, slowly drawing mana into her soul, strengthening it. That way, she would be able to use the spell without the outer circles. The peace was disturbed by voices. Something was happening behind the door. Cage, as always, stood guard and did not let in strangers. The princess had clearly given orders not to disturb her. However, the one who came was special. Ebec insisted. Sweets, as an excuse, sounded harmless. But even that did not change Cage's determination. Leona, a little irritated, moved closer. What did he want this time? She almost ordered him to leave, but she thought, he was a wizard too. Maybe he realized that she was hiding her power. Apparently, he appreciated her efforts. When the door finally opened, Leona looked exhausted. Ebec noticed this and asked how she was. She just shook her head. In response, he offered her a duel. This surprised him. He had not planned to fight. This visit was a farewell. He had turned 12, time to go on a journey, like all members of the imperial family. Roderick, the first prince, had already taken part in the Northern War. Ebec intended to go west. Leona had not seen Roderick before, probably because he had long since left the palace. Ebec explained that he had not come to fight, but to spend some time with her. But Leona did not back down. She wanted to find out how strong her brother was. She was not stopped by either the prohibitions or the Emperor's possible wrath. Cage watched silently. She didn't interfere. Ebec assured her that it wasn't a matter of prohibition. He didn't want to fight because he considered his sister weaker, and the weaker ones aren't beaten. This only fueled Leona's excitement. She wasn't going to give in. He brought gifts. That was great, but she had her own plan. In the end, Ebec gave in. He promised to grant her any wish if she won. Leona smiled. Triumphantly, boldly. Victory was only a matter of time. Cage stood at the entrance to the training center, her eyes fixed on Ibex and Leona. Her expression showed no sign of displeasure, but she remained aloof. She had no right to interfere. Ebec involuntarily glanced at Cage. There was an inner challenge in his gaze. In his mind, he replayed the promise he had made to himself. She wouldn't run away. And then we'll see. The word flashed, ice, but he didn't have time to say it in time. Leona, like a whirlwind, crashed into him at full speed. He managed to avoid a blow to the face, but a ragged cut remained on his arm, near his shoulder. Ebec was stunned. He had not expected Leona to make such a direct attack. Her speed was almost incredible. The distance she covered was beyond the limits of normal movement. Teleportation? It seemed impossible. Leona, silent but focused, gave a dry warning. Don't lose your vigilance. And an earthquake. A powerful wave of magic. A crack went underfoot. Ebec was nearly knocked to the ground. The prince tried to answer. His voice came out with effort. The ice spears flew into the air and rushed towards his sister. But she just smiled. This attack was a trifle for her. The fiery explosion instantly melted the ice, dissolving the magic in the air. Behind Leona, a fire was already burning, and it wasn't scary. It was part of her plan. In the flames, she looked even more threatening. Ebec, meanwhile, was lost in conjecture. 4 elements? That's absurd. That doesn't happen. He gathered his strength, summoned an icy fog. Ebec wanted to shackle Leona's legs, tie her up and attack. But again he didn't have time. A wall of fire rose between them, and Leona herself rose into the air. Her voice sounded haughty, but calm, as if he were just a student taking an exam. Ebec listened, and with each passing moment he realized that there was no chance left. The magic was too powerful, and her control over the elements was almost unreal. He wanted to ask how she did it. She just smiled and didn't answer. That was her secret. Leona had no intention of revealing who she really was. How could she say she was a witch? Then he admitted defeat. Inwardly, even before he fell to his knees, he realized that continuing was futile. Even if the fight had continued, he would have lost. Leona smiled triumphantly. One gesture and all the magic around her dissipated. The earth healed, the flames disappeared, the air became calm. She slowly lowered herself beside him and held out her hand to Ebec. From that moment on, he was her subordinate. Leona confidently stopped in front of Ebec and without any hesitation announced her decision. From now on, he was to become her servant. Ebec raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had not expected such an address, especially after his defeat. The princess clarified, servant number one, because the one who lost must obey the winner. There was not a shadow of a joke in her voice. Ebec admitted that she was right. Indignation was still boiling inside, but his words were clear. I agree. Leona immediately got down to business. She had an errand for him. Ebec was alert. His mind raced with questions. What was the sudden assignment? He was even more confused by the strange lines Leona began to draw on the ground. The movements were precise, deliberate, not random. Everything became clear as soon as he recognized the outline. The kingdom of Carelia emerged from the drawing. The princess explained, that's where he should go. Find out how that kingdom lives, and return. And also, check on the condition of the king. She made a mistake, almost saying Lacus's name, but stopped herself in time. Ebec had to figure out the rest himself. He had a hunch. Maybe Leona just didn't want to get her hands dirty. He asked her directly, but her face changed. She clearly didn't understand what he was getting at. He voiced a guess. She wanted to kill the king with his own hands, but then he too would not escape death. He hoped that Leona was not like the other members of the imperial family, but everything pointed to the opposite. That terrible option still rang in his ears. Murder as an order. Leona denied it, surprised. Murder was not part of her plans. She just wanted her brother to assess the situation and return. No secret infiltrations, no blood. Another truth was swirling in her mind. Lacus had either ruined the country or was hiding behind the mask of a reformer. The truth needed to be found out. Only then could a plan be made. She intended to kill herself. If Ebec dared, he would die. She said this calmly, but resolutely. Her brother only rubbed his face, not understanding where she had gotten this obsessive curiosity about Carell from. The order needed no explanation. Leona reminded him that he was now her servant, and therefore he must obey without question. If he had any doubts, he could always repeat the duel. Smiling, Ebec called her generous. This gesture was rare for a winner. He was struck by the fact that she truly considered him her person. His emotions almost burst out, but he restrained himself. And he promised to complete the assignment in a way that would leave her satisfied. Leona just nodded. A gleam appeared in her eyes. One task had already been set in motion, although she didn't know what exactly Ebec thanked her for so sincerely. Zeros was idly sitting in his tower, aimlessly rolling dice. There was a depressing silence all around. No people, no events. Even the mages were so useless that they had to be banished. Although, it would be worth keeping at least two for company. He lay on the couch and tried to entertain himself in vain. Monster hunting has long since lost its appeal. And it seems there are no monsters left. Raising his hand to the ceiling, Zeros sighed. At least something interesting would have happened. She appeared in his mind again, the 12th princess. Her unusual abilities, like the echo of a reborn soul. There had never been anything like it in the entire history of the continent, unless dragons, out of boredom, resorted to similar tricks. If this is indeed a trace of dragon blood, then the princess is very unlike her ancestors. Too alive, too human, and at the same time, extremely dangerous. Zero sat up abruptly. Thoughts of her suddenly aroused his curiosity. He wanted to see her again, her incomprehensible language, constant quarrels and indignation, even her cheeks, which were always begging for a teasing touch. He decided to postpone the meeting until tomorrow. Because a guest had just appeared in the tower, someone silently crossed the threshold and removed the bandage from his face. The image hidden behind the cloth finally revealed itself. Zeros nodded briefly. He recognized it immediately. Before him stood the ruler of the kingdom of Carell. Lacus approached and smiled. Using levitation, Ebec silently ascended to the roof of Nikila's estate. Barely touching the space in front of him, he immediately felt resistance, mana streaming through the protective barriers. There were too many of them, and the nature of the magic seemed dark, something that belonged to the dead. Without hesitation, Ebec tore down one of the barriers. A faint impulse sounded inside, and Nikhil shuddered. He hadn't expected this. The prince stepped forward and muttered something about the weakness of protective magic. He called Nikhil stupid. Nikhil instantly flared up, angry and confused. The question escaped Nikhil's lips, but he heard a reproach in response. Ebec wanted him to repeat everything he had said about Leona earlier. It was a demand, with an icy undertone. Nikhil was confused, and Ebec calmly explained. For the princess, he was now not just a relative, but a subordinate. He declared this proudly, as if he had won a war. The prince couldn't help himself. An insult escaped his lips, and immediately after that, a fight broke out between the brothers. Meanwhile, Leona and Cage, hiding behind a column, watched Lin. Choosing the right moment, the princess announced that she was going to the library. Cage was to go with her. After promising to be careful, the girls set off down the long corridors. Leona glanced at her companion. For the first time that day, it seemed to her that Cage was more silent than ever. She avoided eye contact, spoke briefly, and for some reason acted reserved. Leona cautiously asked why. Cage answered abruptly. She mentioned the sword. She said she didn't want to be greedy. She said it was jealousy. The princess didn't understand right away. And when she did, she was surprised. Was Cage really jealous of Ebecca? She asked directly. She didn't hear an answer, but the silence was too expressive. Leona explained, Ebec is only a servant, and Cage is her protection. She never intended to use her. It was a sincere promise. Cage kept repeating these words to herself, protecting the princess. It was obvious she was shocked. Leona heard it and couldn't help but say something like, "Oh my God," with relief. Cage looked at her and said briefly, "Happiness." The princess looked away. A strange, almost inexplicable feeling came over her. Finally, they reached the library. Leona immediately dived into the rows of bookshelves. She was looking for something specific, something about the kingdom of Carell. But instead, she found only titles like Country of Criminals. She pulled out a purple-bound collection of 31 years. The book was brand new, only a year old. The 32nd edition was about to be released. So, her death occurred 27 years ago. And since then, she has been living in the body of a princess for 5 years. 5 years passed, and no clear mention of the kingdom of Carell had ever appeared. All traces had been erased. The empire had severed all ties with that land, completely and permanently. Leona had originally intended to use the power of the empire to capture Carell. Now that option was gone. The plan needed to be rethought. She knew, if nothing works out, she would have to become stronger. Otherwise, she would not win. Lacus had gained strength over the years. All this time, he had been obsessively collecting mana. She probably wasn't the only one who had reached the level of a 9th-class mage. But to stand up to him, she would have to become even more powerful. Perhaps even beyond the limits of an ordinary witch. A voice suddenly rang out in the silence of the library. Zeros appeared out of nowhere, as if he had appeared out of thin air. He asked what she was reading. Leona was so frightened that she almost fell down the stairs. She didn't fall. The magician managed to catch her. But instead of gratitude, he heard an exclamation of indignation. The princess swore at him, calling him a fool and scolding him for being so sudden. He apologized, explaining that he just didn't want her to get hurt. but he didn't even have time to finish. Leona was already demanding that he let her go immediately. Zeros even tried to joke that he could disappear as suddenly as he had appeared, but Leona suddenly froze. She smelled a familiar scent. In an instant, her magic was already tightening around Zeros's throat. Her eyes lit up. The princess didn't ask, she insisted. He was dating that bastard. Zeros froze. He didn't even have time to understand what had happened. The blood-soaked sword trembled in Lacus's hands as he uttered a phrase Leona knew all too well. She had once said it herself, to destroy all who annoy. But now these words came from the lips of the one who had once turned her love into betrayal. The memory of him never completely faded. The smell, specific, unsettling, remained with her even after his sword had pierced her heart. Lacus spoke further. He believed that the continent should have one ruler, and this ruler is him. The irony did not escape Leona. The smell of betrayal that permeated that sword she would have recognized among 1,000. Fragments of the past swirled in her mind again. Irene, the witch she had been, stood among the roses, listening to the sweet confessions. Lacus called her perfect then, said he was happy only because of her. He promised love. And then, death. The real shock came suddenly. She realized that she had just rushed at Zeros without warning. Again, acting on impulse, without control. This had to be fixed. The magician, however, did not look angry, only a little puzzled. He was surprised by her increased sensitivity to dog hair. He stopped to pet a small dog on the way, and didn't even think that the fur would stick to his clothes. Leona started sneezing and told him to change his clothes. Zeros, without arguing, used the magic of polymorphism. The change in appearance occurred instantly. This interested the princess. She had never seen a person so easily use dragon magic. Curiosity flared in her eyes. She demanded that Zeros teach her, but he brushed it off, saying he didn't want to, and immediately received a new insult from her. Idiot. He just smiled and moved the subject aside, pointing to the books she was reading. Her attempts to hide her interest in the kingdom of Carell were clumsy. Yes, she was going to become an empress, but really, Carell was interesting to her for a reason. Everything in this state seemed artificially quiet. No war, no scandals, no loud achievements. But with an incredible increase in influence, it was suspicious, too suspicious. She had no doubt that something was hidden here, and if she had to overcome suspicions by force, she would be ready for it. Zeros only sighed, but his silence eloquently hinted at the inner tension. The princess noticed this. She, as always, read between the lines. She asked what he was thinking about next to her, and whether he would like to die. Zeros replied, "No, just thinking about what to choose, her or Carell." And then Leona exploded. She grabbed him by the collar, held him close to her, and shouted in his face, "Is it really not obvious? She always wins. Always." The magician only asked about her age. That stopped her in mid-sentence. She admitted that she was technically 3 years old, and although her soul's experience was much greater, in her current body she was only a child. But would that stop her? He joined her on the stairs. He added that even if she became stronger, there were things that could get in the way. His weakness was money. He confessed without embellishment, greedy, down to earth, drawn to gold. Leona was surprised at first, but then she admitted that everyone likes money, and she has a lot of it. A lot. When Zeros reacted with doubt, she decided to act spectacularly. With a magical gesture, she caused a rain of gold coins to fall everywhere, on the shelves, the floor, the stairs. They glittered, they jingled, they piled up in shiny piles. Now, choose. The magician, not believing his eyes, picked up one coin and ran his fingers along the edge to make sure it was real. Then he got down on one knee in front of her. His voice became soft, his eyes serious. He agreed. If she didn't mind the 200-year age difference between them, then he would stay by her side. And will serve her diligently. Leona smiled slowly. Yes, everything was going exactly as it should. Leona calmly pointed her hand at the scattered gold. Her gaze was confident, without a shadow of doubt. She knew he would be tempted. And Zeros smiled, not restrainedly, but as if in response to something all too obvious. The princess set a condition. This wealth was his. but only in exchange for loyalty. Not in words, but real, sealed by the oath of magicians. An oath that put the most valuable thing at stake, mana, and with it, life. The smile disappeared from the magician's face. He understood that for a sorcerer, this was tantamount to a voluntary death trap. Money is good, but not when its value is measured by its own essence. Leona only slightly tilted her head, saying that the amount could be revised. The fee could be increased if necessary. Zeros lowered his eyes. Now he was ready. He stated it simply, without pathos. She gave him an order, and he accepted. Her voice became firm. This was not a bargain, but a contract. She laid out the conditions. All important conversations would take place only face to face. Not a word to outsiders, not a single mention, not even a hint. He only nodded briefly. Then, loyalty until the moment of her accession to the throne, without excuses or escapes, and also, to come whenever she calls. Zeros smiled again, warmer, as if he saw something personal in that stern form. He hinted at feelings. Could it be love? But Leona was not led astray. His joy was nipped in the bud. No, it's just a deal. And finally, the fourth condition. He must maintain contact with the kingdom of Carell, to spy. No more hints, straight away. His face lit up with curiosity, then faded again. The deal suited him, but not everything seemed completely transparent. He wondered if it would really be enough. Leona didn't answer directly, but it was clear from her look that yes, that was more than enough. His remark that she was the first to use the head of the magic tower as a spy only amused her. When she half-jokingly asked if he needed to add more gold, he just shrugged it off. He could spy on eternity for the coins. At least that's what he said. And indeed, when it came to money, his eyes lit up. She noticed it. She looked at him suspiciously. She wondered how naive he really was. When it came to the oath, Leona had clearly defined the deadline until she came of age. Zeros seemed to have expected something more, perhaps even an eternal vow. But he got exactly what he wanted. No lifelong contracts. She would keep no one around longer than necessary. The mage accepted the terms. His body was enveloped in purple-black mana, twisted into symbols that ordinary humans could not see. It was a magical connection. Real, strong, dangerous. Leona watched the process. A memory flashed through her mind. She had once made a similar oath. Lacus? He was there again, and again the shadow of the past. Zeros noticed the change in her expression. At those moments, she seemed like a child, although her voice sounded adult. The princess clenched her fist and, without wasting time, got to the point. She wanted to know what Lacus was up to and what was happening in Corellia right now. The magician admitted that the ruler is indeed preparing something, but the target for now is the southern lands. Formally, it is none of their business. The empire is located in the east. Leona suddenly turned pale. She remembered. The south was the same mountain range, her territory, the Fire Witch's range. Zeros just shrugged. Yes, the same. But what's the difference? The witch is long dead. Leona's insides froze. His words sounded like a sentence. She couldn't believe it. How did he know? King Carell himself started the rumors. He spread the news of his own victory across the continent. He said he had personally killed the very witch. They made no secret of it. Leona remained silent until she exploded. Fury flared in her eyes. When she becomes empress, Carell will be wiped off the map. The First Order. Zeros was silent. Inside, he noted mentally, this girl really hates that kingdom. But Leona quickly cooled down. The oath had already been taken, and now there was no turning back. She glanced at the magician with a sly smile. It was impossible to return the gold. Zeros didn't quite understand what was going on. Return it? And why? And then Leona threw out her main trump card. All those treasures are not her property. They belong to Eskin. If the magician spends even one coin, problems will inevitably arise. But she consoled him. She would pay him every month. 10 gold pieces would be enough, wouldn't they? Zeros was still examining the coins when the truth began to catch up with him. It was all an illusion. Her magic had deceived him. The princess had managed to fool the head of the magic tower. Him. He didn't know what to say. Confusion had completely taken over his consciousness, and Leona was already laughing, loudly and victoriously. She had won. Leona yawned, barely suppressing the urge to fall face down on the pillow. Fatigue weighed on her shoulders, and her eyelids were closing on their own. However, her day was not over yet. Lin, like clockwork, reminded her in time. The fourth prince was waiting. Being late could cost her her mood, and Nikhil's spoiled mood was an unpredictable thing. The princess sighed and obediently moved forward. She was always comfortable when needed, not because she was afraid. She just knew that it was easier to keep everything under control this way. The palace, as always, breathed cold and silent gloom. But here the streams of magical energy were purer than anywhere else. They swirled around her as if alive. The mana level was rising, and Leona smiled at the corner of her lips. A place like this was worth lingering in for a long time. Nikhil was already waiting for her in the room. He instantly forgot everything as soon as he saw her, and rushed it to hug her with childish enthusiasm. As always, he was sincere, emotional, a little too direct. He wondered why she was late, or if she had gotten lost in the library again. She nodded without explaining. In fact, deep down, she was glad that she had managed to shift some of the responsibility onto Zeros. Even reading in the library had been useful. He was surprised that she was reading by herself. Lin, who had appeared unnoticed, confirmed that the princess was already quite well versed in letters. Nikhil beamed and assured him that he would tell the fourth sage about it.